For most of human history, survival did not collapse with a battle, a storm, or a sudden disaster. It often began with something quieter, a dry season that lasted slightly longer than usual, a migration of animals that passed somewhere else, trees that produced fewer fruits than they had the year before. For early human groups living close to the limits of their environment, food rarely existed far beyond the present moment. What could be gathered, hunted, or shared today often determined whether children and elders would eat tomorrow. Archaeological and ecological evidence suggests that many early communities lived within narrow margins between enough and not enough. In such a world, survival was not only about strength, tools, or intelligence. It was about whether the land would repeat what it had done the previous year. When the rhythm of a single season changed even slightly, the consequences could move quietly through an entire group. And this raises a difficult question that sits at the beginning of human history. If the balance between people and their environment was this fragile, how could something as ordinary as a single difficult season begin to push whole communities toward hunger? And why could one bad season starve early humans? The modern world often gives the quiet impression that food is a stable background of life. Stores remain stocked across seasons, harvests arrive from distant regions, and most people rarely experience a day when food simply disappears from the landscape around them. Yet for the overwhelming majority of human history, the situation was very different. For early human communities, food was not a permanent feature of the environment. It was something that appeared and disappeared with the movements of animals, the growth of plants, and the shifting patterns of weather. Survival depended not only on knowledge or effort, but on the fragile balance between people and the land that supported them. Archaeological and anthropological research suggests that many small human groups lived in environments where resources were sufficient most of the time, but rarely abundant for long periods. In such settings, the difference between stability and hardship could be surprisingly small. A landscape that seemed generous one season might become noticeably quieter the next. The herds that had once passed through a valley could take a different path. The fruiting trees that had produced food the previous year might produce less the following year. None of these changes needed to be dramatic. Even subtle shifts in rainfall, temperature, or migration patterns could influence the availability of food. Early human communities were skilled observers of their surroundings. Over thousands of generations, they learned where certain animals were likely to appear, when particular plants ripened, and which areas of land tended to provide reliable resources. This knowledge formed the foundation of survival, but knowledge alone could not guarantee that nature would behave the same way every year. Environmental systems rarely repeat themselves perfectly. Climate records from ice cores, lake sediments, and other natural archives show that even within generally stable periods, local conditions could vary from season to season. For people living close to the natural rhythms of the landscape, these variations mattered greatly. Most groups of hunter-gatherers moved across territories that contained multiple types of resources, allowing them to shift their focus as conditions changed. This mobility offered flexibility, but it did not eliminate uncertainty. If several important food sources declined at the same time, the options available to a group could narrow quickly. When the margin between food supply and daily needs is small, even modest changes can ripple through an entire community. In such circumstances, the concept of enough becomes very sensitive to the environment. A place that supports a group comfortably during one season may support them only marginally during another. Because early human populations were relatively small and widely dispersed, they often relied on landscapes that could sustain them only within certain limits. The environment did not need to collapse for difficulty to appear. It only needed to become slightly less productive than usual. This delicate relationship between people and their surroundings helps explain why seasonal changes carried such weight in early human life. Seasons were not merely markers of time. They structured the availability of food, water, and animal movement. When a season unfolded in a familiar way, the knowledge accumulated across generations helped guide communities through it. But when a season behaved differently, that accumulated knowledge could become less reliable. The result was not always immediate crisis. Instead, the first signs might appear gradually: fewer animals encountered during hunts, smaller harvests of edible plants, or longer distances traveled in search of food. These subtle signals could mark the beginning of a difficult period. For people living without large stores of preserved food, time mattered. Each passing week without sufficient resources increased pressure on the group. Children needed nourishment to grow, adults needed energy to travel and gather, and elders depended on the success of others. Under these conditions, the boundary between a normal season and a dangerous one could be surprisingly narrow. When that boundary was crossed, the consequences could slowly spread through a community. The question that emerges from this fragile balance is not simply why early humans sometimes faced hunger. The deeper question is how a single season, only slightly different from the ones before it, could begin a chain of events that pushed entire groups towards scarcity. Across many environments where early humans lived, food rarely existed as a stable background of life. Instead, it appeared in pulses. A grove of trees might provide fruit for several weeks and then remain quiet for months. A migration of grazing animals might pass through a valley for a short period before continuing toward distant grasslands. Rivers might offer fish during certain parts of the year and far fewer at other times. For communities living without agriculture or large storage systems, survival meant learning to move within these rhythms. Archaeological evidence from many regions suggests that early human groups often followed seasonal routes, returning to familiar places when certain resources were expected to appear. These routes were not random wanderings but careful patterns shaped by long observation of landscapes. Over generations, people learned that particular hillsides produced edible plants after the rains, that certain valleys attracted animals during dry periods, or that coastal areas offered shellfish when inland resources became scarce. Knowledge like this was one of the most powerful tools early humans possessed, yet even detailed knowledge could not remove the uncertainty built into natural systems. Landscapes change from year to year. Rainfall may arrive earlier or later. Temperatures may shift slightly. Storms may disturb plant cycles or animal movements. Each of these changes can alter the timing or abundance of food. When several of these variations occur at the same time, the effects can accumulate in ways that are difficult to predict. For a community depending on many small sources of food rather than one large supply, these small disruptions can slowly reshape the entire season. A group might begin a journey expecting to find animals along a familiar migration route, only to discover that the animals have passed earlier than usual. The people might then rely more heavily on plant foods, but those plants might also produce less than expected if the rains had been irregular. In this way, a season that appears normal at first can gradually reveal itself to be less generous than the one before it. Because early humans typically lived in small groups, the number of people sharing the landscape mattered greatly. When a territory contained just enough resources to support a group during a typical season, the margin for error remained narrow. If the availability of food dropped even modestly, each person had to travel farther or spend more time searching to gather the same amount of nourishment. Anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies show that daily food gathering often required long periods of walking, searching, digging, or tracking animals. When resources became less predictable, the effort required to obtain food could increase noticeably. The landscape itself did not necessarily appear empty. Plants still grew, and animals still existed, but the energy needed to obtain them gradually rose. This balance between energy spent and energy gained is central to understanding survival in early human environments. When a hunt succeeds or a patch of edible plants is found, the effort invested in searching is rewarded with enough food to sustain the group. But if success becomes less frequent, the same effort may bring smaller returns. Over time, that imbalance can begin to affect the health and resilience of a community. Adults may have less energy for long journeys, and children may receive less nourishment than usual. None of these changes occur suddenly. They accumulate slowly, often over the course of a season that simply feels more difficult than the last. What makes this situation especially important in the story of human history is that early communities had limited ways to buffer these fluctuations. Without large storage systems or extensive trade networks, the environment itself remained the primary source of stability. When the environment provided reliably, groups could move through their territories with confidence. But when familiar patterns began to shift, the reliability of those landscapes weakened. A valley that had sustained a group in previous years might now offer less than expected. Each missed opportunity forced the group to search wider areas, spend more time gathering, and rely on resources that might normally serve only as supplements. In such circumstances, the difference between a manageable season and a dangerous one could depend on a series of small disappointments rather than a single dramatic failure. A slightly weaker plant harvest, a delayed migration, or an unusual stretch of dry weather might seem minor on their own. Yet together they could gradually transform the landscape into a place where food became harder to find. When those changes unfolded across the length of a single season, the pressure on early human communities could begin to grow in quiet but powerful ways. Even when a landscape continued to hold life, the experience of finding food could change quietly from one season to the next. A valley might still contain animals, yet those animals might appear less frequently or move more cautiously through the terrain. A hillside might still hold edible plants, yet those plants might grow in smaller clusters or mature later than expected. From a distance, the environment could appear unchanged, but the daily work of gathering food would slowly reveal that something in the balance had shifted. For early human communities, these subtle differences mattered because food was rarely separated from time. Each day required a certain amount of nourishment, and each day offered only limited hours to search for it. When a group moved across the land in search of resources, success depended on the relationship between effort and reward. If the effort invested in searching, tracking, digging, or collecting produced enough food, the group could continue the rhythm of daily life. But if the same effort began to produce less food than before, the rhythm gradually became strained. Anthropologists often describe this balance as an energetic relationship between people and their environment. Humans must spend energy to obtain energy. Walking across long distances, climbing hills, digging for roots, or tracking animals through difficult terrain all require physical effort. In return, successful gathering or hunting provides calories that allow the body to recover and continue the cycle. When food is relatively abundant, the exchange remains favorable. The landscape gives back enough nourishment to justify the effort invested in searching. But when the environment becomes less productive, the exchange begins to change. A hunter may travel farther before encountering animals. A gathering trip may require longer hours to collect the same quantity of edible plants. The body continues to spend energy, even when success becomes less certain. Over the course of many days, this imbalance can slowly reduce the strength and endurance of the people involved. The situation becomes especially delicate in communities where cooperation supports survival. Early human groups depended on shared labor and shared food. Some individuals specialized in tracking animals, others in locating plant foods, and many activities required cooperation between several members of the group. When food returns decline, the effects spread beyond the individual who searched for it. Fewer successful hunts or smaller plant harvests mean less food available for everyone who depends on the group's efforts. Children, elders, and individuals recovering from illness rely on the strength and success of others. In such circumstances, a season that yields slightly less food can place pressure on the entire community. Archaeological evidence from many regions suggests that early human populations often remained relatively small and mobile, partly because landscapes could support only limited numbers of people at one time. A territory that supported a group during favorable seasons might not sustain them as easily during less productive periods. Mobility offered one response to this problem. When resources became scarce in one place, a group could travel toward another area that might offer better opportunities. Yet movement also required energy and carried its own uncertainties. A distant valley might contain new resources, but it might also hold unfamiliar terrain, competing groups, or equally limited food supplies. In this way, mobility did not eliminate the risk created by seasonal variation. It merely offered a way to search for better conditions when familiar patterns began to fail. Because of these limits, early human communities lived within landscapes that were neither endlessly generous nor entirely hostile. Most of the time, the environment provided enough to support daily life. People learned the rhythms of animals, the growth cycles of plants, and the geography of water and shelter. These patterns formed a reliable guide through many seasons. Yet reliability in nature is rarely perfect. The systems that produce food, rainfall, temperature, soil conditions, and animal movement are themselves shaped by complex ecological processes. When those processes shift, even slightly, the effects can ripple outward through the chain that connects environment, plants, animals, and people. In such a system, the margin between stability and hardship can remain surprisingly thin. A season that offers a little less food than expected may not appear dangerous at first. The land still contains life, and people continue to move, gather, and hunt. But over weeks and months, the effort required to sustain the group may slowly increase while the rewards gradually decline. When that pattern continues long enough, the quiet imbalance between effort and nourishment begins to reveal a deeper truth about early human life. Survival often depended not on dramatic disasters, but on whether the environment would remain just productive enough for another season. Long before calendars divided the year into equal months, human life moved according to patterns that repeated in the land itself. The most important unit of time was not a numbered year, but the sequence of seasons that shaped the appearance of food across the landscape. In many regions where early humans lived, the difference between seasons could transform the environment completely. A dry plain might become green after rainfall. Rivers that were shallow during part of the year could swell and carry fish during another. Certain plants would emerge only for a short period before disappearing again beneath the soil or drying under the sun. For communities whose survival depended on gathering and hunting, these changes defined the rhythm of life. People did not simply live in a place, they lived within the timing of that place. The arrival of a season often signaled the return of familiar opportunities. After rains, edible plants might spread across open ground. In cooler months, certain animals might move into valleys where water and grazing were easier to find. Coastal areas might offer shellfish at predictable points in the yearly cycle. Knowledge of these patterns accumulated gradually through observation. Over many generations, early human groups learned when particular resources were most likely to appear and how long they would remain available. This knowledge helped guide movement through the landscape, allowing communities to return to areas that had previously supported them. Yet this rhythm also meant that time itself carried a biological meaning. Each season did not simply mark a passage of days, it opened or closed access to food. When a season arrived as expected, the environment followed familiar patterns that people understood. But if the timing of a season shifted, even slightly, those expectations could become uncertain. Rainfall that arrived later than usual might delay the growth of plants. A shorter wet period might reduce the number of animals drawn to new vegetation. Cooler or warmer temperatures could alter the behavior of species that people relied upon. Because early humans depended directly on these ecological patterns, the timing of seasons mattered almost as much as the presence of resources themselves. In many ecosystems, the abundance of food was concentrated into relatively short windows. Fruits might ripen for a few weeks, fish might gather in certain waters briefly, and migrating animals might pass through an area only once before moving onward. During these windows, people could gather food efficiently and sustain the group with relatively predictable effort. Outside these windows, the landscape might still contain resources, but they could become more scattered and harder to obtain. The difference between these periods created a natural cycle of relative abundance and relative scarcity. This rhythm did not necessarily mean that every difficult season produced immediate hunger. Human communities developed flexibility to adapt to seasonal variation. Groups could shift their focus from plant foods to animals, from inland areas to coastal zones, or from one region of a territory to another. Such strategies allowed people to navigate the normal changes of the environment. But these strategies worked best when seasonal patterns remained within familiar limits. If the timing of a season changed enough to disrupt several resources at once, the system that guided movement and gathering could lose its reliability. A group might arrive in a place expecting food that had already disappeared or had not yet arrived. Each such mismatch between expectation and reality forced people to search again for alternatives. Over time, repeated mismatches could reshape the entire season into something less predictable than the one before it. For early humans, this unpredictability carried particular weight because time could not easily be stored. When a window of abundance closed, it could not simply be postponed until conditions improved. If a harvest of wild plants failed to appear, or if animals moved along a different route, the opportunity connected to that moment in the year vanished. The next opportunity might come weeks or months later, but the needs of the community continued every day. Children still required nourishment, and adults still needed strength to travel and search for resources. In this way, the passing of seasons shaped not only the landscape, but also the possibilities available to the people moving within it. The question that begins to emerge from this seasonal rhythm is how sensitive the system could become when its timing shifted. If survival depended on moving through a series of ecological windows that opened and closed across the year, then even a small disruption in those windows could change the entire experience of a season. What appeared from a distance to be only a slightly unusual year might, from the perspective of the people living within it, gradually transform the landscape into a place where familiar sources of food no longer aligned with the time in which they were needed. In many landscapes where early humans lived, the turning of a season did more than change the weather. It reorganized the entire pattern of life across the land. When rains arrived after a dry period, grasses and small plants could spread across open ground. These plants would attract grazing animals, which in turn might draw predators and scavengers into the same region. A valley that had seemed quiet only weeks earlier could suddenly hold movement, sound, and opportunity. For people who depended on hunting and gathering, this transformation meant that the same place could feel completely different at different times of the year. The landscape itself did not remain static. It moved through cycles of productivity that shaped where people traveled and how they searched for food. Anthropological research suggests that many hunter-gatherer societies organized their movements around these recurring ecological changes. Groups might return to certain locations when fish gathered in rivers, when particular fruits ripened, or when herds passed through open plains. These movements were rarely random. They reflected careful attention to how seasons influenced the availability of resources. Over generations, people learned that certain places became reliable only during particular periods of the year. Outside those periods, the same areas might provide very little nourishment. This understanding created what might be described as a seasonal map of the landscape. Instead of a single territory that produced food continuously, early human groups moved through a network of places that became useful at different times. Each location formed part of a sequence that stretched across the year. When one resource declined, another might begin to appear elsewhere. The success of this strategy depended on the assumption that these seasonal patterns would remain broadly consistent. If plants usually ripened after the first rains, or if animals typically migrated along certain routes, people could plan their movements with some confidence. But natural systems rarely repeat themselves with perfect precision. Weather patterns shift from year to year, sometimes subtly and sometimes more noticeably. Rainfall might arrive later than expected, shortening the period in which plants grow. A colder or warmer season could influence the timing of reproduction in animals or the development of vegetation. These variations might appear small when viewed over long spans of time, yet for communities relying on seasonal resources, they could alter the sequence that guided survival. A group might travel to a place expecting to encounter animals that had not yet arrived or that had already moved on. Edible plants might emerge later than usual, leaving a temporary gap in the food supply. Each disruption forces people to adapt their plans in real time, searching for alternatives in landscapes that may already be under pressure. The difficulty of this situation becomes clearer when considering how tightly the seasonal sequence can be connected. In many environments, one resource appears shortly after another disappears. When one window closes, the next is expected to open soon after. This pattern creates a chain of opportunities that allows communities to move from one food source to the next. However, if one link in that chain shifts significantly, the space between opportunities can widen. A delay in plant growth might occur just as animal migrations are ending. Fish that normally gather in rivers might arrive after the period when plant foods are most abundant. The result is not necessarily an empty landscape, but a landscape in which the timing of resources no longer aligns in a helpful way. For early humans, these misalignments could quietly reshape the entire season. Instead of moving smoothly from one reliable source of nourishment to another, people might find themselves spending longer periods searching without success. Travel distances could increase as groups explored wider areas, hoping to encounter resources that had once appeared predictably. Each additional day of searching required energy, patience, and cooperation within the group. When these efforts succeeded, the seasonal rhythm could recover. But if the disruptions continued, the season itself might begin to feel less reliable than those remembered from the past. This sensitivity to timing reveals why seasons held such power in early human life. They were not simply divisions of the year, they were the framework that determined when and where food could be found. A season that followed familiar patterns allowed knowledge and experience to guide survival. A season that shifted even slightly could make that knowledge less certain. And when uncertainty entered the rhythm of food across the landscape, the entire system that supported human communities began to depend on how quickly new opportunities could be discovered before the old ones disappeared completely. Across long stretches of human history, the passing of seasons shaped not only where people moved, but also how they understood time itself. Without written calendars or mechanical clocks, the signs of the natural world served as the most reliable markers of change. The arrival of certain birds, the flowering of specific plants, or the swelling of rivers after distant rains could all signal that a new phase of the year had begun. These environmental signals carried practical meaning because they often corresponded with the appearance of food. When a plant began to flower, it might indicate that fruits would soon follow. When grazing animals moved toward fresh vegetation, hunters knew that their paths might soon cross those same routes. Over generations, such observations formed a detailed awareness of seasonal patterns embedded within daily life. This awareness allowed communities to anticipate opportunities before they fully appeared. A group might begin moving toward a valley before animals arrived there, knowing from experience that the timing was approaching. The success of this strategy depended on the stability of natural cues. When the signals of the environment occurred in familiar sequences, knowledge gathered across generations could guide people through the year with surprising accuracy. Yet natural systems do not always maintain perfect regularity. The same environmental signs that once predicted the arrival of food could become less reliable when weather patterns shifted. A flowering plant might appear earlier or later than usual. Birds might migrate along different routes if distant climates changed. Rivers that once rose at predictable moments might swell unpredictably or remain low for longer periods. Each of these changes could weaken the connection between environmental signals and the food resources that people expected to follow them. When these signals lost some of their reliability, the seasonal map that guided human movement also became less certain. A group might travel according to familiar cues only to find that the resource they anticipated had not yet appeared. In other cases, the resource might have already passed before they arrived. The difficulty here was not simply that food had vanished, but that the timing connecting knowledge to opportunity had shifted. When the rhythm of seasons changes, knowledge built over generations does not disappear, but it may require adjustment that cannot occur instantly. People must observe the new pattern, experiment with different movements, and gradually learn which signs remain trustworthy. During that period of adjustment, uncertainty grows. This uncertainty becomes more significant when the chain of seasonal opportunities leaves little space between them. In many environments, early humans moved from one temporary abundance to another across the year. Fish might gather during a particular phase of river flow, fruits might ripen shortly afterward, and grazing animals might pass through once new grasses appeared. When each stage followed the next in familiar order, communities could travel through the year in a sequence that balanced effort and reward. But if the timing of several stages shifted even slightly, the spaces between them could widen. The delay of one opportunity might coincide with the early disappearance of another. Instead of transitioning smoothly between resources, people might encounter longer intervals in which the landscape offered fewer reliable options. In these intervals, the effort required to sustain the group could increase significantly. Hunters might travel farther searching for animals that had moved elsewhere. Gatherers might spend longer hours collecting plants that appeared in smaller quantities. Water sources might also shift with the seasons, affecting where animals and people could remain for extended periods. As these changes accumulate across weeks and months, the entire experience of a season can gradually become more demanding. The landscape itself still contains life, but its timing no longer aligns as neatly with the needs of the people moving within it. The deeper implication of this seasonal sensitivity is that survival in early human environments depended on more than the presence of food alone. It depended on the alignment between human movement and the timing of ecological events. When that alignment held, communities could navigate the year through a sequence of opportunities shaped by generations of observation. But when the rhythm of seasons shifted enough to disrupt that alignment, the difference between a familiar year and a difficult one could emerge slowly. A single season that unfolded out of step with expectations might not appear extraordinary at first glance. Yet within the daily search for nourishment, its subtle disruptions could begin to accumulate. By the time the season drew to a close, the landscape might reveal that the quiet changes in its rhythm had carried consequences much larger than the small variations that began them. Human survival has always depended on a continuous flow of energy into the body. Every movement, walking across uneven ground, lifting tools, climbing slopes, searching for plants, or tracking animals requires calories that must eventually be replaced through food. In the modern world, this exchange is easy to overlook because food often exists in constant supply. Yet for most of human history, the relationship between the body and the environment remained immediate and unavoidable. Energy spent during the day had to be restored by what could be found in the landscape. If the landscape offered less food than expected, the human body could not simply pause its needs. It continued to require nourishment each day, regardless of whether the environment was generous or difficult. From a biological perspective, the human body carries only limited reserves that can support extended shortages of food. Humans are capable of storing energy in the form of body fat, and these reserves can help people endure short periods when food becomes scarce. However, these reserves are not designed to sustain long interruptions in nourishment, especially in physically demanding environments. Early human life required regular activity, traveling across territories, gathering plants, preparing food, caring for children, and maintaining social cooperation within the group. All of these tasks draw energy from the body's internal stores. When food intake decreases for many days or weeks, those stores begin to shrink. The body gradually shifts into a state of conservation, slowing certain processes and reducing available strength. This adjustment can help individuals survive temporary shortages, but it also limits their ability to perform the very activities needed to obtain more food. In this way, the human body reflects a delicate balance between resilience and vulnerability. It can endure short interruptions in food supply, yet it depends on regular nourishment to maintain the physical capacity required for survival. This balance differs from the strategies used by many other animals living in seasonal environments. Some species survive long periods without food by entering forms of dormancy or by storing large quantities of energy before winter. Bears, for example, accumulate fat reserves that allow them to pass through months of reduced activity. Certain small mammals slow their metabolism dramatically during cold seasons. These strategies reduce the need for constant food intake while environmental conditions remain unfavorable. Humans, by contrast, do not possess a biological system that allows extended dormancy in response to seasonal shortages. The human body remains active across the year, maintaining body temperature, supporting brain function, and sustaining physical movement. This constant activity means that energy must continue to flow into the body with relative regularity. Even when people reduce physical effort during difficult periods, the body's essential functions still require nourishment. This biological reality shaped the way early humans interacted with their environments. Because the body could not pause its basic needs for long periods, people had to remain engaged with the landscape in search of food throughout the year. Resting for weeks while waiting for conditions to improve was rarely an option. Instead, individuals and groups continued to move, search, and adapt even during seasons when resources became harder to find. The body's energy balance therefore connected human survival directly to the productivity of the surrounding ecosystem. When the environment provided enough food, people could restore the energy they spent in daily activity. When the environment produced less, the body began to draw upon its internal reserves. Over time, if the shortage continued, the ability to travel, hunt, and gather could gradually weaken. What makes this biological constraint especially significant in early human history is that it operates quietly. Hunger does not always appear suddenly as a dramatic event. More often it begins with subtle reductions in nourishment that accumulate across days and weeks. A slightly smaller meal, a longer search for food, or a missed opportunity to gather resources may seem minor when considered individually. Yet the body registers each of these changes. As the balance between energy gained and energy spent shifts, physical resilience slowly declines. When this process unfolds across an entire season that produces less food than usual, the human body becomes one of the first places where the consequences of environmental change begin to appear. The limits of the human body become easier to understand when we consider how daily survival required constant physical effort in early environments. Movement across the landscape was rarely optional. People walked long distances between water sources, plant patches, and animal paths. Tools and gathered foods had to be carried. Shelter had to be found or prepared. Even simple tasks such as digging for roots or breaking open nuts demanded repeated bursts of muscular work. None of these activities could be postponed for long, because the needs of the group continued each day. Children needed to be fed, fires needed fuel, and new food had to replace what had already been eaten. Under these conditions, the body functioned as both the engine and the storage system of survival. Energy obtained from food-fueled movement, and a small portion of that energy could be stored temporarily within the body for later use. Yet the amount that could be stored was modest compared with the continuous energy demands of an active human life. Anthropological research on modern hunter-gatherer societies suggests that daily food gathering and hunting often require several hours of sustained effort. While conditions differ across environments, this pattern reflects a general biological reality. Humans must remain active to secure the resources that keep them alive. When the environment becomes less productive, the same tasks require greater persistence. A search that once took a short walk may expand into a journey across wider territory. Tracking animals may require longer observation and more patience before an opportunity appears. Gathering plant foods may involve digging deeper, climbing farther, or sorting through larger areas of vegetation. Each of these adjustments increases the energy spent before food is finally obtained. The body must therefore invest more effort in order to restore the same amount of nourishment. This relationship between effort and reward can become unstable when food becomes harder to find. If the body spends more energy searching than it gains from what is eventually eaten, the balance gradually shifts in the wrong direction. At first, the difference may be small. A day of slightly lower food intake may be followed by another day that compensates for it. But if the imbalance continues across many days, the body begins to draw more heavily on its stored reserves. Fat deposits slowly diminish, and muscle tissue may also begin to supply energy when other sources decline. As these reserves shrink, physical strength and endurance can decrease. The person who once traveled easily across the land may begin to tire sooner. The ability to track animals for long periods or carry heavy loads may weaken. What makes this situation particularly challenging is that the tasks required for survival do not disappear when the body grows weaker. If anything, they may become more demanding. When food becomes scarce, groups often expand their search areas or attempt new strategies to locate resources. These responses require coordination and physical effort from multiple members of the community. Yet individuals whose bodies are already drawing upon their reserves may find these tasks increasingly difficult. In this way, a gradual reduction in nourishment can influence the ability to obtain future nourishment. The process unfolds quietly, without a clear dividing line between normal hardship and dangerous shortage. For early human communities, cooperation offered an important buffer against these biological limits. Food obtained by one individual could be shared with others, allowing the group to distribute the results of successful hunts or gathering trips. This sharing helped smooth out the uneven returns that often occur when searching for food in natural environments. Some days might produce more than enough nourishment, while others might produce very little. Through sharing, these fluctuations could be balanced across the group. Yet even cooperative systems depend on the overall productivity of the environment. If many individuals return with smaller amounts of food over extended periods, the pool of shared resources gradually declines. The biological needs of each person remain the same, but the supply available to meet those needs becomes thinner. The body then reveals the quiet consequences of this imbalance. Energy levels fall, endurance decreases, and the tasks required to restore stability grow more demanding. In this way, the human body acts as a sensitive indicator of changes in the surrounding landscape. When the environment provides enough nourishment, physical strength supports the continuous cycle of movement and gathering. When the environment produces less than usual, the body begins to absorb the difference. Across the span of a season, this biological response can slowly transform a difficult period into one that places increasing strain on the people living within it. Over time, the relationship between the human body and the environment becomes visible not only in daily activity, but also in the traces left behind in human remains. When archaeologists study ancient skeletons, they sometimes encounter subtle markers that suggest periods when food was less available. These markers do not usually tell the story of a single dramatic event. Instead, they reflect repeated moments when nourishment was interrupted or reduced during growth and development. In the enamel of teeth, for example, researchers occasionally observe faint horizontal lines that formed while the tooth was still developing. These lines are understood to represent periods when the body experienced stress, including times when nutrition may have been temporarily limited. Because teeth grow gradually during childhood, they can preserve a timeline of these interruptions. A single line does not necessarily mean severe hunger, but it can suggest that the body had to adjust to a period when conditions were less favorable than usual. Similar signs sometimes appear in bone structure, where slowed growth or minor irregularities may indicate that the body diverted energy toward essential survival functions rather than steady development. Such evidence reminds us that the human body responds continuously to the conditions surrounding it. Growth, strength, and health are closely tied to the regular availability of food. When nourishment becomes inconsistent, the body adapts in ways that help protect vital organs and maintain basic function. Yet these adjustments often come with trade-offs. Energy directed toward immediate survival may reduce the energy available for long-term growth, repair, or resilience. Over the course of a lifetime, these small adjustments can accumulate, leaving quiet evidence of how environmental conditions shaped human lives. For early human communities living close to natural cycles, these biological responses would have unfolded within the rhythm of the seasons. A year that produced slightly less food might not lead to immediate collapse, but it could create a period in which meals became smaller or less frequent. Adults might continue searching for food while consuming less themselves so that children could be fed. In such situations, the physical effects of reduced nourishment might first appear in those who are still growing. Children, whose bodies require steady energy for development, are particularly sensitive to fluctuations in food supply. When nourishment becomes inconsistent during these years, the body records the experience in ways that can later be observed in skeletal remains. This pattern suggests that environmental variations did not affect everyone equally. The needs of the body change across different stages of life. Young children require nutrients for growth, while adults must maintain strength and endurance to secure food for the group. Elders, whose bodies may already be less resilient, can also become vulnerable when nourishment declines. Because early human communities often included individuals of many ages, the biological consequences of a difficult season could ripple unevenly through the group. Some individuals might maintain enough strength to continue searching for resources, while others might feel the effects of scarcity sooner. The collective survival of the group depended on balancing these different needs within the limits set by the environment. This perspective reveals an important aspect of the human condition during most of prehistory. The body itself functioned as a sensitive measure of the surrounding ecosystem. When landscapes provided stable nourishment, people could grow, travel, and reproduce with relative resilience. When the productivity of the environment declined, the body began to reflect that change long before it became visible as a dramatic crisis. Slight reductions in nourishment could influence growth, endurance, and resistance to illness. Over time, these biological responses could accumulate across an entire community. The presence of such traces in archaeological records does not imply that early humans lived in constant hunger. Many environments supported human populations successfully for long periods, yet these traces remind us that the balance between people and their food supply often remain narrow. Because the human body depends on steady nourishment and carries only limited reserves, even modest environmental disruptions could leave their mark. When those disruptions extended across the length of a season, the biological connection between people and their landscape became increasingly clear. The environment did not need to fail completely for human bodies to feel the change. It only needed to provide a little less than usual for the quiet signals of scarcity to begin appearing within the lives of the people who depended on it. When we imagine the diets of early humans, it is often tempting to picture an endless variety of foods spread across the landscape. Forests may seem full of fruits and animals, grasslands rich with herds, rivers crowded with fish, yet the reality of most natural environments is more restrained. While many plants and animals exist in a region, only a smaller number can actually serve as reliable food sources for human communities. Some plants contain toxins or offer little nutritional value. Certain animals are difficult to capture with simple tools or appear only rarely in accessible areas. Others may be edible but too small or scattered to provide significant nourishment. As a result, the list of foods that people could realistically depend on in a given territory was often narrower than the total number of living species around them. Anthropological studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies show that even in biologically diverse environments, daily meals often rely heavily on a relatively small group of staple resources. These staples might include a few types of roots, nuts, fruits, or animals that appear frequently enough to justify the effort of searching for them. Over time, communities become familiar with the locations, seasons, and behaviors associated with these key foods. Knowledge accumulates around them, where they grow, how they can be prepared, and when they are most abundant. This familiarity allows people to gather or hunt efficiently. Yet it also means that a large portion of survival may depend on the continued availability of a limited number of dependable resources. If one of these key resources becomes less abundant, the effect can extend far beyond the loss of a single food item. In many landscapes, the dependable foods that support human life are linked closely to specific ecological conditions. A certain plant may require a particular pattern of rainfall to grow well. A species of grazing animal may depend on seasonal grasses that appear only after certain weather conditions. When the environment shifts even slightly, the productivity of these species can change. A drier season might reduce the number of edible roots in the soil. A cooler or warmer year could influence how many fruits appear on trees. If these changes affect one of the main foods relied upon by a community, people may need to adjust their strategies quickly. They might search for alternative plants, hunt different animals, or move toward areas where resources remain more stable. However, substitutes are not always equal in value. Some foods require more effort to collect or contain fewer calories. Others may appear only in scattered patches that cannot support a large group for long. In these situations, the presence of many species in the environment does not automatically guarantee that enough food will be available. The practical question becomes whether the specific resources that humans can efficiently gather or hunt remain plentiful enough to sustain daily life. The difference between theoretical abundance and practical availability can be surprisingly large. A forest may contain many edible plants, but only a few that grow in quantities large enough to feed a group repeatedly. Similarly, a region may contain many animals, yet only certain species provide the size, behavior, and predictability that make them worthwhile targets for hunting. When those key species fluctuate in number, the overall food supply available to humans may change significantly, even if the ecosystem itself still appears healthy. This pattern highlights an important feature of early human survival: dependence on a limited set of reliable foods within each landscape. People were flexible and capable of using many resources, but their daily nourishment often rested on a smaller foundation of dependable species. When the environment supported these species well, communities could move through their territories with confidence. When conditions reduced the abundance of those same species, the entire balance of the food system could shift. A territory that had once seemed rich might begin to yield smaller returns, not because life had vanished from the land, but because the particular foods that sustained human bodies had become harder to find. In this way, the diversity of nature did not always translate into stability for human survival. The question then becomes how vulnerable such a system could be when several of these key foods responded to environmental change at the same time, gradually reshaping what a single season could provide. In many natural environments, the foods that sustain human communities are not evenly distributed across the landscape. Instead, they appear in clusters, specific patches of land where conditions allow certain plants to grow well, or where animals gather more frequently. A grove of nut trees might provide nourishment for several weeks each year, while the surrounding forest offers far fewer edible resources. A stretch of riverbank might attract fish during certain phases of the water cycle, even though other sections remain relatively quiet. These concentrations of food create focal points in the landscape where human activity becomes more intense. Over generations, people learn the locations of these productive areas and return to them whenever the season is right. Such places often become deeply familiar parts of a community's territory, not because they are the only sources of food, but because they provide the most reliable returns for the effort invested in gathering or hunting. When a group arrives at one of these productive patches, the difference can be noticeable. Food can be collected more quickly, and the time spent searching across wide areas may temporarily decrease. The presence of these concentrated resources allows people to rebuild their energy reserves after long periods of travel or scarcity. Yet this same pattern also introduces a subtle vulnerability into the system of survival. Because certain areas produce food more reliably than others, human communities may depend heavily on those locations at specific times of the year. If the productivity of such a place declines during a particular season, the effect can extend beyond the immediate loss of food. A grove that once supported a group for weeks might produce only a fraction of its usual harvest. A river stretch that once held abundant fish might offer only scattered catches. When these familiar locations fail to deliver the expected returns, people must quickly expand their search across less predictable parts of the landscape. The difference between a reliable patch and the surrounding terrain can be substantial. Outside these productive areas, edible resources may be more dispersed and require greater effort to obtain. Gathering might involve digging through wider stretches of soil, climbing trees that yield only a few fruits, or tracking animals that appear less frequently. Each additional hour spent searching increases the energy invested in obtaining food. If the environment continues to produce fewer returns than expected, the balance between effort and nourishment becomes harder to maintain. The situation becomes even more complex when several productive patches respond to environmental changes at the same time. Many plant species depend on similar patterns of rainfall or temperature. When those conditions shift, multiple food sources may decline together. For example, a dry period might affect both fruiting trees and the grasses that attract grazing animals. Rivers influenced by the same climate pattern may hold fewer fish. In such cases, the alternatives that people might normally rely upon also become less dependable. A community moving from one familiar location to another might discover that each offers smaller returns than usual. What makes this pattern especially important in early human history is that these changes often unfold gradually rather than dramatically. A productive area may still contain food, but not in the quantities that once made it dependable. The first gathering trip might return with slightly fewer fruits. A hunting attempt might require longer hours before success. These early signs may not immediately signal a serious problem. Yet when they repeat across several visits to different locations, a pattern begins to emerge. The landscape still appears alive and capable of supporting human activity, but the efficiency of obtaining food slowly declines. Because early human groups depended on multiple locations across their territories, the health of each patch contributed to the stability of the entire system. When most of these places produced normally, the system remained resilient. People could move between them and maintain a steady flow of nourishment. But when several of them yielded less food during the same season, the entire network of resources could weaken at once. The territory itself did not need to become empty for difficulty to arise. It only needed to become slightly less productive across several key locations. In such circumstances, the difference between a normal year and a challenging one might appear not as a sudden failure of nature, but as a quiet shift in the reliability of the places people had depended on for generations. As early human communities moved through landscapes shaped by scattered patches of food, their survival depended on a delicate pattern of expectation and adaptation. Certain areas became known not only for what they produced, but for when they produced it. A hillside where edible roots grew well after seasonal rains might attract people at roughly the same time each year. A stretch of woodland where particular nuts ripened might become a temporary gathering place once the fruits began to fall. These locations were not permanent settlements in the modern sense, but they formed recurring points within the seasonal movements of a community. Over many generations, knowledge about these places deepened. People learned which slopes held the richest soils, which valleys sheltered plants from harsh winds, and which wetlands attracted animals seeking water during dry months. This knowledge created a practical geography of survival that existed alongside the physical landscape. Yet even the most familiar locations remained subject to forces beyond human control. The productivity of plants and animals depends on environmental conditions that shift subtly across time. A tree that produced a heavy crop of fruit one year might bear far fewer the next. Root plants that grew abundantly after strong rains might remain sparse if moisture arrived too late. The animals that fed upon these plants could also alter their movements if grazing areas changed. When such variations occurred in isolation, communities often had ways to respond. A poor harvest in one place might be balanced by better resources elsewhere. However, When several of these dependable locations produce less food within the same season, the network of options available to a group could narrow quickly. This narrowing does not necessarily mean that the landscape suddenly becomes empty. Instead, it means that the reliable patterns people depended on begin to weaken. A grove that once yielded baskets of edible plants might offer only a small collection. Another location might still contain food but require much longer effort to gather the same amount. As these experiences accumulate across the territory, the efficiency of movement begins to change. People must travel farther between productive areas and spend more time searching once they arrive. In ecological terms, the landscape has become less predictable for human use, even though it still supports many forms of life. This gradual shift can influence how groups organize their daily activities. When reliable food patches are plentiful, time can be divided among many tasks. Some individuals gather plants, others search for animals, while others prepare tools or care for children. When food becomes harder to obtain, a larger portion of the group's effort must focus on searching and gathering. Activities that once occupied smaller parts of the day may begin to dominate the routine of survival. The landscape itself begins to shape the rhythm of work more strongly than before. Over the course of weeks, these adjustments can transform how a season is experienced by the people living within it. What once felt like a sequence of dependable opportunities may gradually feel like a series of uncertain searches. Each return to a familiar location carries the quiet question of whether the resources will appear as they once did. When several such visits produce smaller rewards, the memory of past abundance becomes less certain as a guide for the present. In this way, the relationship between humans and their landscapes is constantly renegotiated through experience. Early human communities did not simply rely on nature, they interpreted its signals and adjusted their movements accordingly. Yet the knowledge guiding these movements was always built upon patterns that could change. A season that unfolded differently from those remembered in the past might not immediately appear extraordinary. It might still contain plants, animals, and water in many places. But if the familiar locations that once anchored survival begin to yield less food across the same stretch of time, the entire system of movement and expectation can begin to shift. The landscape remains alive, yet the pathways that once led efficiently to nourishment become less certain. When this happens across the span of a single season, people may find themselves spending more time searching across wider spaces while receiving smaller returns for their effort. It is within these subtle changes that the quiet beginnings of scarcity can take shape, long before the environment appears truly barren to the eye. Across many regions of the world, large animals rarely remain in one place throughout the year. Their movements often follow the growth of vegetation, the availability of water, and the shifting conditions of the seasons. When grasses flourish after rain, herds may gather to feed on the new growth. When dry periods arrive and plants begin to wither, those same animals may travel long distances in search of better grazing. These patterns of movement, repeated across generations, create what we recognize as migration. For early human communities, the migrations of animals could shape the rhythm of hunting in ways that were as important as the seasons themselves. In landscapes where large grazing animals formed a major part of the food supply, human groups often learned to anticipate these movements. Knowledge of migration routes allowed hunters to position themselves where animals were most likely to pass. Valleys, river crossings, and narrow corridors between hills could become especially important because animals moving across wide territories often funneled through these natural pathways. Over time, such locations became familiar hunting grounds where people returned when the season suggested that herds might appear again. The success of this strategy depended on the relative consistency of animal behavior. If herds followed similar routes each year, hunters could rely on accumulated experience to guide their movements, but migration is influenced by environmental conditions that can vary from one year to the next. Rainfall, temperature, plant growth, and water availability all affect where animals choose to travel. If the distribution of grasses changes across a landscape, the animals that depend on them may alter their paths accordingly. A route that once attracted herds might become less appealing if vegetation there becomes sparse. Instead, animals may move toward areas where conditions remain more favorable. When such shifts occur, the change can be subtle at first. A herd that once arrived at a certain valley every year may pass slightly farther away or arrive at a different time than expected. Hunters who travel to a familiar location may find fewer animals than they remember from previous seasons. Because migration routes can extend across vast distances, even environmental changes occurring far away may influence where animals appear locally. Rainfall in distant grasslands, for example, may draw herds in a direction that prevents them from reaching the places where people once encountered them. For early humans, whose hunting success depended on anticipating these movements, such variations could introduce new uncertainty into the search for food. Hunting large animals often required significant investment of time and cooperation. Tracking signs across the landscape, observing animal behavior, and coordinating with other members of the group could occupy many hours or even days. When a hunt succeeded, the reward could be substantial, providing food that sustained the community for several meals. Yet the success of such hunts depended on the presence of animals in predictable places. If herds altered their movements, the effort invested in reaching those places might yield little reward. Hunters might spend long periods searching across valleys that once held animals but now appear empty or quiet. The challenge is not only the absence of animals in a particular moment, but the uncertainty that follows. If one hunting ground produces fewer animals, people may travel to another location where herds were once seen. But migration routes that shift in one area may also shift elsewhere. Each journey across the landscape becomes an attempt to rediscover where animals have chosen to move during that particular season. This process can require patience and repeated exploration, especially when environmental conditions differ from those remembered in previous years. In this way, the movements of animals introduce a dynamic element into human survival. The landscape may still contain herds somewhere within it, yet their location changes according to ecological forces that humans cannot fully control. When those forces cause migration routes to shift away from familiar hunting grounds, the connection between human knowledge and animal movement begins to loosen. What once appeared to be reliable patterns can become uncertain pathways, leaving hunters to search more widely for the animals that once arrived with predictable regularity. When animal movements follow familiar paths across a landscape, human hunters can gradually learn the signs that signal their arrival. Tracks in soft ground, distant sounds of herds, and the condition of grazing areas may all provide clues that animals are nearby. Over generations, this knowledge becomes part of the shared experience of a community. Certain valleys are remembered as places where animals often pass. River crossings become known as points where herds slow their movement and gather. Narrow passages between hills may reveal traces of repeated travel by the same species. These locations can serve as natural meeting points between people and animals, where hunting efforts have a greater chance of success. Yet, this familiarity depends on the assumption that animals will continue to use these routes. In reality, migration paths are shaped by environmental conditions that rarely remain identical from year to year. A shift in rainfall can influence where grasses grow most abundantly. A change in temperature may alter the timing of plant growth across a wide region. When vegetation appears earlier or later in one area, grazing animals may adjust their movements to follow the most favorable food sources. These changes can ripple outward across the landscape, redirecting the paths that herds take during their seasonal journeys. To a hunter waiting at a familiar crossing, the difference may first appear as a simple absence. Days may pass with fewer signs of animals moving through the area. Tracks that once appeared frequently in the soil may become rare. The silence of the valley may suggest that the herd has already passed or chosen another route entirely. Because migration can involve large numbers of animals traveling together, missing a herd can represent the loss of a major opportunity for food. The effort invested in preparing for the hunt, traveling to the location, observing the terrain, coordinating with others may yield little return if the animals do not appear. When this occurs, hunters must begin searching across a wider region to locate where the animals have moved. Such exploration requires time and energy. Groups may travel to alternative valleys or follow distant tracks across unfamiliar terrain. Each new direction offers the possibility of encountering the herd again, yet also carries uncertainty. Animals may continue moving beyond the places where hunters search, or they may settle in regions that are difficult for humans to reach. While the landscape itself still contains animals somewhere within it, the connection between human movement and animal movement becomes less certain. The consequences of this uncertainty grow when the timing of migration also changes. Herds that once arrived during a predictable part of the season may appear earlier or later than expected. If hunters arrive at a location based on previous experience, they may discover that the animals have not yet come or have already passed. The opportunity for a successful hunt becomes a matter not only of place but also of timing. A difference of only a few weeks in migration patterns can transform a reliable hunting ground into an empty one. These variations illustrate how closely human survival was tied to the behavior of other species. Early humans did not simply hunt animals whenever they wished. Instead, they positioned themselves within the ecological patterns that guided animal movement. Knowledge of those patterns allowed people to anticipate where food might appear, but it could not guarantee that animals would follow the same paths every year. When environmental conditions changed enough to influence migration routes or timing, the strategies that once worked reliably might become less effective. Hunters might need to travel farther, wait longer, or attempt different methods to locate the animals they depended on. During seasons when these adjustments proved difficult, the difference between a successful hunt and an empty landscape could become increasingly uncertain. Even though animals still existed across the broader ecosystem, their shifting movements could make them temporarily inaccessible to the people who relied on them for nourishment. For communities that relied on hunting, the movements of animals shaped not only where people traveled, but also how they organized their expectations for an entire season. A successful hunt could provide a significant amount of food, enough to support several members of the group for a period of time. Because of this, the appearance of migrating animals often represented one of the most important opportunities in the yearly rhythm of survival. When herds passed through a familiar region, hunters could prepare for the possibility of success by gathering tools, observing the terrain, and cooperating with others to guide animals into favorable positions. These moments of opportunity could briefly strengthen the balance between effort and nourishment, allowing people to rebuild energy after periods when food had been more difficult to obtain. Yet the reliability of these opportunities depended on forces beyond human control. Animals move according to the needs of their own survival, responding to the conditions of the environment rather than to the expectations of human hunters. If the distribution of grasses changes, herds may adjust their paths in search of better grazing. If water becomes scarce in one area, animals may travel toward distant regions where rivers or wetlands remain more dependable. These adjustments can occur gradually, sometimes shifting migration routes only slightly from one year to the next. But even small shifts can alter where and when animals appear in relation to the places where people once encountered them. From the perspective of the landscape, animals still exist in large numbers somewhere within the broader ecosystem. The difference lies in whether their movements intersect with the areas that human groups can reasonably reach during a particular season. A herd that moves only a few valleys away from its former route may still be thriving, yet hunters who travel to the old location may see no sign of it. The absence of animals in a familiar place can therefore reflect a change in movement rather than a true decline in the population. For the people waiting there, however, the practical result is the same. The anticipated source of food does not appear. When this occurs repeatedly across a season, the consequences gradually expand beyond a single missed hunt. Hunters may attempt to follow distant tracks or explore new valleys in search of the animals. Each journey across unfamiliar terrain requires time and energy that might otherwise have been spent gathering plants or preparing tools. Some attempts may eventually lead to success, but others may reveal that the animals have continued moving beyond reach. The longer this search continues, the more uncertain the relationship between human effort and the return of food becomes. This uncertainty also influences the structure of cooperation within the group. Hunting large animals often requires coordination between several individuals, and the success of one hunt may support people who did not participate directly in the search. When hunts succeed, food can be shared across the community, helping maintain stability even if other food sources are temporarily limited. But when repeated hunting attempts yield little success, the supply available for sharing gradually decreases. People may rely more heavily on smaller animals or plant foods, which often require more time to gather and may provide fewer calories for the effort invested. In such circumstances, the role of large migrating animals as a seasonal foundation of nourishment begins to weaken. The landscape still holds life, yet the predictable meeting points between hunters and herds have become uncertain. The result is not necessarily a dramatic disappearance of food, but a subtle shift in how difficult it becomes to obtain it. What once served as a reliable moment of abundance may pass without notice. leaving the community to rely on slower and less productive sources of nourishment. When such changes occur within the span of a single season, they can quietly reshape the balance between people and their environment. The animals remain part of the ecosystem, moving across plains and valleys according to the needs of their own survival. Yet if those movements no longer intersect with the places where human groups once found them, the practical availability of food can diminish even while the broader landscape continues to appear full of life. In many environments where early humans lived, plants formed a large and reliable portion of daily food. Edible roots, nuts, fruits, seeds, and leafy plants often provided nourishment when hunting was uncertain or when animals were difficult to find. Gathering these foods required patience and careful knowledge of the landscape, but in many places plants offered a steadier source of calories than large animals. Unlike animals that moved across wide territories, plants remained rooted in particular soils. This meant that once people learned where useful plants grew, those places could become dependable parts of their seasonal movements. A valley rich with edible roots might be visited again and again, while a hillside with fruiting trees could become an important destination during the weeks when the fruit ripened. Yet the stability of plant foods carried its own limitations. Unlike crops grown under human control, wild plants follow ecological rhythms that cannot be predicted with complete certainty. The growth of many edible species depends closely on rainfall, temperature, soil moisture, and the timing of seasonal changes. When these conditions align in favorable ways, plants may produce abundant harvests. Roots may grow large beneath the soil, fruits may appear in heavy clusters, and seeds may cover open ground in quantities that make gathering efficient. But when environmental conditions shift, the same plants may respond very differently. A dry period may prevent roots from expanding to their usual size. A colder season may delay the flowering that eventually produces fruit. Even a change in the timing of rain can alter the development of plants across an entire region. These variations are part of the natural dynamics of ecosystems. Plants respond continuously to the environment around them, adjusting their growth according to the resources available in soil and climate. For early humans who relied on these plants as food, this responsiveness meant that plant harvests could vary from year to year even in the same location. A grove of trees that once produced plentiful fruit might yield far fewer during another season. The ground that once held many edible roots might contain only scattered patches when rainfall had been insufficient. In such cases, the plants themselves have not disappeared entirely. They still exist within the landscape, but their productivity has changed. For people gathering food, this difference becomes immediately noticeable through the effort required to collect it. When plants grow abundantly, a gathering trip may fill baskets quickly. Individuals can collect many edible items within a small area before returning to the group. But when plant growth has been reduced by environmental conditions, gathering may require longer searches across wider spaces. A person may dig several holes before finding a usable root, or climb several trees before discovering fruit that has matured fully. The time spent searching increases. Even though the landscape may still appear green and full of vegetation, the consequences of these changes extend beyond the immediate harvest. Plant foods often serve as a dependable foundation that supports human communities when other resources fluctuate. When hunting produces uncertain results, gathered plants can provide steady nourishment. If the productivity of these plants declines during the same season, one of the stabilizing elements of survival begins to weaken. The group must then depend more heavily on alternative resources that may themselves be limited or unpredictable. Over the course of a season, this shift can alter the balance between effort and reward in daily life. The landscape still holds plants, but the amount of nourishment available from them may no longer match the expectations built from previous years. When this pattern occurs across many gathering locations at the same time, the change may reveal itself slowly through longer hours of searching and smaller collections of food. What once felt like a familiar and dependable harvest may gradually become an uncertain task. In this way, the quiet relationship between plants and climate can influence the stability of human survival without dramatic signs of environmental failure. The plants remain part of the ecosystem, continuing their cycles of growth and decline. Yet if a season produces fewer edible plants than usual, the difference between what the land offers and what people require can begin to widen in subtle but meaningful ways. The growth of wild plants rarely follows a perfectly steady pattern from one year to the next. In natural ecosystems, plants respond to a combination of environmental signals that guide their development across the seasons. Rainfall provides the moisture that allows roots to expand and leaves to grow. Temperature influences how quickly plants move through their stages of flowering and fruiting. Sunlight, soil nutrients, and the presence of competing vegetation all shape how much energy a plant can devote to producing edible parts. When these factors align in favorable ways, the result can be a season of noticeable abundance. Fruit-bearing trees may produce heavy clusters, grasses may cover open ground with seeds, and root plants may grow large beneath the soil. In such moments, gathering can feel efficient and rewarding, as if the landscape itself is offering nourishment with relative generosity. Yet these conditions rarely repeat themselves exactly each year. Natural systems fluctuate, sometimes in small ways and sometimes more noticeably. A rainy season may arrive later than expected, shortening the time plants have to grow before dry conditions return. A sequence of cooler days may slow the flowering process that eventually leads to fruit. In some cases, rain may fall heavily during a short period and then disappear, leaving soil moisture unevenly distributed across the landscape. Each of these variations can influence the productivity of plants without eliminating them entirely. To a person walking through the environment, the change may not be immediately obvious. Trees may still stand full of leaves, and the ground may still appear green. Yet when people begin to gather food, the difference gradually becomes clear. Fruit may appear in smaller numbers, seeds may be scattered thinly, and edible roots may require more searching before they are found. One of the reasons these variations matter so much is that many edible plants concentrate their productivity into relatively brief windows during the year. Fruits often ripen within a limited period, sometimes lasting only a few weeks before falling or being eaten by animals. Seeds may become available only when grasses dry and release them onto the ground. Even roots and tubers, though hidden beneath the soil, can change in size and nutritional value depending on how much moisture the plant has received during its growth. When these windows of abundance become shorter or less productive, the opportunity to gather food narrows accordingly. People may arrive at a familiar location expecting to find a plentiful harvest, only to discover that the season has produced fewer resources than usual. Gathering then becomes a slower process of collecting scattered items rather than harvesting dense clusters. The difference is not merely one of convenience. The time spent searching for each edible plant represents energy that must be balanced by the nourishment eventually obtained. If that nourishment becomes smaller in quantity, the balance between effort and reward begins to shift. Over the course of many gathering trips, this shift may require people to travel farther between productive patches or to explore areas that were previously visited less often. Such adjustments illustrate how closely the stability of plant foods depends on environmental timing. A season that unfolds slightly differently from those remembered in previous years may still contain edible plants, yet their appearance may no longer align with the patterns that once guided human movement. In such a situation, the landscape continues to offer resources, but the efficiency of obtaining them gradually declines. Each gathering trip yields a little less food for a little more effort. Over time, this quiet change can influence the entire rhythm of daily survival. What once served as a dependable source of nourishment may now require greater persistence and wider exploration. When these conditions persist across a season, the difference between abundance and scarcity can emerge not through sudden disappearance, but through the steady reduction of what the land is able to provide. Even when plants continue to grow across the landscape, the difference between a generous season and a difficult one often appears in the details of what they produce. A tree may still cover itself in leaves, yet bear only a small number of fruits. A field of grasses may still rise from the soil yet release far fewer seeds when the dry season arrives. To the eye, the environment may still appear vibrant and full of life, but the quantity of nourishment hidden within that life can vary greatly from year to year. For people gathering food, this difference becomes clear only through repeated visits to familiar places. A hillside that once provided many baskets of fruit may now offer only scattered pieces among the branches. The same trees still stand there, but the effort required to gather a meaningful amount of food has increased. This subtle change in productivity is a common feature of wild ecosystems. Many plants do not produce the same harvest every year. Some species naturally vary in the quantity of fruit or seeds they produce, responding to the availability of water, sunlight, and nutrients. In certain years, the environmental conditions may encourage plants to invest heavily in reproduction, filling the landscape with edible resources. In other years, the same species may conserve energy, producing smaller harvests while focusing on survival. From the perspective of the plant, this variation is part of a long ecological strategy. From the perspective of people gathering food, it can reshape the experience of an entire season. When a plant that once served as a dependable source of nourishment produces less food than usual, the change rarely affects only one gathering trip. The reduced harvest appears again and again each time people return to the same location. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. The landscape still holds the plants, but the plants are offering less nourishment than expected. Individuals must then expand their search to other patches of land, hoping that conditions there have produced better results. Yet, environmental influences often extend across large regions. If rainfall has been low or temperatures have shifted across a broad area, multiple gathering locations may show similar reductions in productivity. A group moving from one familiar patch to another may discover that each yields smaller returns than in previous years. The plants themselves have not vanished, but their ability to support human needs has declined in several places at once. This pattern gradually transforms the rhythm of gathering. Instead of collecting abundant food within a limited space, people must cover wider distances to assemble the same amount of nourishment. Hours of searching may produce only modest results. The energy spent traveling and digging increases while the amount of food gathered in return becomes smaller. Because plant foods often serve as a steady foundation in the diet of many hunter-gatherer communities, this shift can influence the entire balance of survival. When fruits, seeds, or roots appear in smaller quantities, other food sources must compensate. Hunters may attempt to capture more animals, or groups may travel toward new areas in search of different resources. Yet these adjustments require time and effort, and the success of alternative strategies is never guaranteed. What once felt like a dependable harvest becomes a sequence of uncertain attempts to gather enough nourishment for the day. The change is not always dramatic. The land still contains plants, and people continue to collect what they can. But as the season unfolds, the quiet difference between abundance and limitation becomes more visible through daily experience. Baskets fill more slowly, journeys across the landscape become longer, and the margin between effort and reward narrows. By the time the season approaches its end, the accumulation of these small reductions may reveal that the environment has provided less food than the community expected. The plants have followed their own ecological rhythms, responding to conditions that humans cannot fully control. Yet the consequences of those rhythms appear directly in the lives of the people who depend on them, shaping whether the season feels generous or quietly insufficient. For most of human history, food did not exist in large reserves waiting to be used whenever it was needed. Instead, nourishment was closely tied to the moment in which it was found. When people gathered plants or hunted animals, much of that food had to be eaten within a relatively short time. Without durable storage containers, controlled environments, or preservation technologies that could keep food safe for months, early human communities often lived within a narrow window between finding food and consuming it. The landscape functioned as the primary storehouse, and people returned to it repeatedly rather than drawing from large supplies kept in one place. This way of living shaped how communities experienced abundance and scarcity. When a hunt succeeded or when a gathering trip brought back large quantities of edible plants, the group could eat well for a time. Meals might become larger, and energy that had been spent searching for food could be restored. Yet even during such moments of success, much of the food could not remain usable for long. Meat from hunted animals, unless consumed quickly or shared widely, would begin to spoil. Fruits and leafy plants could soften or decay within days. Even roots and nuts, which sometimes lasted longer, still required careful handling and could not always be stored indefinitely without protection from moisture, insects, or animals. Because of these limitations, many early human groups relied on patterns of immediate consumption and sharing rather than long-term storage. Food that was obtained in larger quantities often circulated quickly through the community. This sharing helped ensure that resources were used before they spoiled, and that individuals who had not participated directly in a successful hunt or gathering trip could still receive nourishment. The practice also strengthened social bonds within the group, as cooperation and mutual support became essential elements of survival. Yet this system worked best when new food could be found again soon after the previous supply had been eaten. The environment itself had to provide a continuing flow of resources across the days and weeks of the season. When this flow slowed, the absence of stored reserves could become more noticeable. Unlike societies that developed large granaries or preserved foods for extended periods, early human communities often depended on the expectation that tomorrow's search would produce something new. This expectation did not mean that people were unaware of methods to extend the life of certain foods. In many places, humans eventually learned techniques such as drying meat in the sun, smoking fish over fires, or storing durable foods like nuts in protected locations. These methods could help prolong the usability of some resources. However, the effectiveness of such practices varied across environments and time periods. Many preserved foods still required suitable conditions to remain safe and edible, and the quantity that could be stored was often limited by the tools and materials available. As a result, large and reliable stores of food remained uncommon in much of early human history. This reliance on the landscape as the primary source of nourishment created a rhythm in which the present moment held special importance. Food discovered today sustained the group through the immediate future, but it rarely guaranteed security far beyond that. Each new day brought the need to search again, to walk familiar paths across the territory, and to look for signs that animals or plants had appeared once more. When the environment followed its usual patterns, this rhythm could continue smoothly. Gathering trips and hunting efforts might produce enough food to maintain a steady flow of nourishment across the season, but if the environment began to offer fewer opportunities than expected, the absence of substantial reserves could quickly reveal the limits of the system. The group might realize that the food obtained yesterday had already been consumed, while the food expected today had not yet been found. In such moments, the difference between abundance and uncertainty became clear. The land still contained plants and animals somewhere within it, yet the immediate availability of nourishment depended entirely on whether the next search would succeed. When this uncertainty extended across several days or weeks within a season, the experience of living without large reserves could gradually transform a period of reduced productivity into a growing challenge for the community. In environments where large stores of food were uncommon, the timing of meals and the rhythm of gathering became closely connected. Each successful hunt or gathering trip briefly stabilized the balance between effort and nourishment. People could eat, recover their strength, and prepare for the next search across the landscape. Yet this balance remained temporary because the supply of food obtained during one moment rarely lasted long enough to remove the need for continued activity. Even when a group obtained more food than it required for a single day, the usefulness of that food often declined quickly as time passed. Meat, for example, contains large amounts of moisture and nutrients that make it valuable as nourishment, but also vulnerable to spoilage. In warm environments especially, fresh meat can change rapidly if it is not consumed or preserved soon after the animal is killed. Without containers that protect against insects or animals, and without cool storage spaces, much of the meat obtained from a hunt would need to be eaten within a short period. Some portions might be dried or smoked to extend their usability, but these methods require time, suitable weather, and careful attention. If conditions were not favorable for preservation, the group often relied on sharing the food widely so that it could be consumed before it deteriorated. Plant foods also followed similar limits, though in different ways. Fruits and soft plants often remain edible only for a short time after they are gathered. Once removed from the tree or soil, they begin to lose moisture and nutrients, gradually becoming less suitable for consumption. Roots and tubers can sometimes remain usable for longer periods if stored carefully, but even these foods can decay when exposed to damp soil, insects, or animals that search for them. Nuts and seeds may last longer than many other plant foods, yet collecting and protecting large quantities requires effort and materials that may not always be available. Because of these constraints, early human communities often experienced food not as a long-lasting supply, but as a series of brief moments of availability. A successful gathering trip could fill baskets for a day or two, after which the process of searching began again. A hunt might produce a substantial quantity of meat, yet that abundance might fade quickly once the food had been shared and consumed. This pattern created a cycle in which nourishment flowed through the group rather than accumulating in large reserves. The land remained the true storage place, holding plants and animals that could be found again when needed. This relationship between people and their environment worked best when the landscape produced resources at intervals that matched the needs of the community. If food could be gathered or hunted regularly, the absence of large storage systems was less problematic. Each day's effort led to another opportunity to obtain nourishment. However, when the environment offered fewer opportunities across several days or weeks, the limitations of immediate consumption became more apparent. The food obtained earlier had already been eaten, while the food expected from the next search had not yet appeared. In such situations, the rhythm of survival began to feel less secure. A community might recall a successful hunt or harvest from earlier in the season, yet that abundance could not easily be carried forward into the present. Without reliable ways to preserve large amounts of food, people could not always transform one moment of abundance into long-term protection against future scarcity. Instead, the stability of nourishment depended on the continuation of favorable conditions in the landscape. Each new search for food became a moment when the balance between human effort and environmental productivity would be tested again. If the environment continued to produce enough plants or animals, the cycle could continue smoothly. But if the productivity of the landscape declined for long enough, the absence of stored reserves meant that the effects would appear directly in the daily experience of the people moving through it. The absence of large and dependable food reserves meant that early human communities often experienced nourishment as something that moved through time, rather than something that accumulated against the future. A successful hunt or gathering trip could briefly create a sense of abundance. Yet that abundance rarely extended far beyond the immediate days that followed. Food was eaten, shared, and gradually disappeared, leaving the group once again dependent on what the landscape might provide next. In this way, survival depended less on what had been obtained in the past and more on what could be found in the present. This pattern placed great importance on the continuity of opportunities in the environment. If plants, animals, or other resources appeared regularly across the season, communities could move from one moment of nourishment to another with relative stability. The memory of previous success did not need to be transformed into large stores of preserved food because the environment itself functioned as a living reserve. When one source of food faded, another often emerged in a different location or at a slightly later time. This sequence created a rhythm in which the landscape repeatedly offered chances to restore energy and maintain the cycle of daily life. Yet this rhythm depended on the assumption that such opportunities would continue to appear before the previous supply had completely disappeared. When that assumption held true, the absence of large reserves remained manageable. But when the interval between opportunities widened, the limitations of this system began to reveal themselves. A group might finish the food gathered earlier while waiting for the next expected source to appear. If that source arrived later than usual, or produced less nourishment than expected, the gap between supply and need could gradually become visible. The group still possessed the knowledge of where food might normally be found, yet the timing of the landscape no longer aligned with those expectations. The difference between having food yesterday and finding none today could therefore arise not because the environment had completely failed, but because the rhythm connecting one opportunity to the next had shifted slightly out of step. In such situations, people often responded by expanding their efforts across the landscape. Hunters might search farther for animals that had not appeared in familiar places. Gatherers might explore additional patches of plants beyond the usual locations. These responses demonstrate the flexibility that allowed early humans to survive across diverse environments for thousands of generations. Yet flexibility also requires energy and time. Each new journey across unfamiliar terrain involves effort that must eventually be balanced by nourishment. If the landscape continues to offer fewer opportunities than expected, the effort invested in searching may begin to exceed the energy gained from what is found. Because earlier abundance cannot easily be preserved for long periods, the memory of past success offers limited protection against present scarcity. The group must rely once again on the hope that the next search will restore the balance between effort and nourishment. In this way, the absence of large food reserves did not automatically produce hardship in every season. Many environments supported human communities successfully through the repeated appearance of plants and animals. But this system also meant that stability depended on the continuity of those appearances. When the chain of opportunities connecting one moment of nourishment to the next began to stretch farther apart, the present could no longer rely on the past for support. Each day of searching carried greater significance because it determined whether the rhythm of survival could continue uninterrupted. If the landscape offered another chance soon enough, the cycle would recover. If that chance remained distant, the quiet gap between yesterday's food and tomorrow's hope could begin to widen into something more difficult to bridge. Human survival has never been determined by food alone. It has also depended on how that food must be shared among the people who rely on it. In early human communities, a group was rarely composed only of strong adults capable of gathering plants or hunting animals every day. Instead, it usually included individuals at different stages of life, each with different needs and abilities. Young children required care and nourishment while their bodies were still developing. Older members of the group might possess valuable knowledge about the landscape, but may no longer have the strength to travel long distances in search of food. Pregnant women and individuals recovering from illness also required additional support from others. These differences created a structure within the group where not everyone could contribute equally to the task of finding nourishment. Yet everyone depended on the success of that task for survival. Anthropological studies of many small-scale societies show that cooperation and food sharing often play central roles in sustaining communities where resources are uncertain. When one person succeeds in hunting or gathering food, the benefits often extend beyond that individual. Meat or gathered plants may be distributed among many members of the group, helping ensure that those who are temporarily unable to search for food are still supported. This practice strengthens social bonds and reduces the risk that any single person will face hunger alone. At the same time, it means that the resources obtained from the landscape must be divided among several individuals whose needs vary across age and circumstance. The presence of children within a community illustrates this balance particularly clearly. Human childhood is unusually long compared with that of many other animals. Young children require many years of growth and learning before they can fully participate in the activities that provide food for the group. During this period, they rely almost entirely on the efforts of adults. Their bodies require steady nourishment not only for daily energy but also for physical development. If the availability of food declines even temporarily, children may be among the first to experience the effects, because their growth depends on consistent access to nutrients. Elders represent another important part of this structure. While older members of a group may not always contribute large amounts of physical labor to hunting or gathering, they often hold knowledge about seasonal patterns, plant locations, and animal behavior gathered across decades of experience. This knowledge can guide younger members of the group in their movements across the landscape. In many communities, the presence of elders strengthens decision-making and memory about where food might be found during different times of the year. Yet elders themselves depend on the success of others to obtain the nourishment they require. Their survival is closely tied to the overall productivity of the environment and the cooperation of the group. When food is plentiful, this structure can function smoothly. Adults gather or hunt, children are fed and protected, and elders contribute knowledge that helps guide future searches for resources. The distribution of food across the group reinforces relationships of care and cooperation. But when the landscape begins to produce less food than usual, the balance between needs and supply becomes more delicate. The amount of nourishment obtained from the environment must still support individuals who cannot gather it themselves. Each successful hunt or harvest must stretch across several lives. Under these conditions, even small reductions in food availability can carry wider consequences. A meal that once fed many people comfortably may now feel smaller when divided among the same number of individuals. Adults may continue to search for food with determination, but the responsibility they carry extends beyond their own survival. The well-being of children, elders, and others within the community depends on the outcome of each search. As a season unfolds with fewer resources than expected, the structure of the group itself becomes part of the story of scarcity. The landscape does not feed individuals in isolation. It supports entire communities whose members depend on one another. When that support weakens, the effects ripple quietly through the relationships that sustain the group. Within a small human community, the effort required to obtain food was rarely carried equally by every member of the group. In most cases, the daily work of traveling long distances, tracking animals, digging roots, or climbing trees for fruit fell primarily on adults who possessed both strength and experience. These individuals form the active core of the group's search for nourishment. Their movements across the landscape connected the needs of the entire community with the resources offered by the environment. Yet even within this group of active adults, differences in ability and circumstance shaped how much each person could contribute during a particular time. Some individuals might travel farther or hunt more frequently, while others might remain closer to camp to care for children or assist with preparing food and tools. The balance between these roles created a flexible system in which cooperation allowed the group to function as a unit rather than as isolated individuals. This structure meant that the success of the community depended on the productivity of a limited number of people at any given moment. If a few hunters succeeded in capturing a large animal, the resulting food might sustain many members of the group. If gatherers located a patch of plants rich with edible roots or seeds, the harvest could support several families at once. In such moments, the effort of a small number of individuals produced nourishment for many others. This relationship between effort and distribution worked well when the landscape continued to provide opportunities for success. But when the environment produced fewer resources than expected, the same structure could also amplify the effects of scarcity. A hunting trip that returned empty did not affect only the hunters themselves. It affected every person waiting for the food they hoped the hunters might bring. A gathering trip that produced only a small amount of food had to be divided among individuals whose needs remained the same as before. In a group where many people relied on the success of a smaller number of providers, the margin between sufficiency and limitation could become narrow. Anthropological observations of contemporary foraging societies suggest that food sharing often helps smooth these fluctuations. When one household or individual obtains more food than others, the surplus may be distributed across the group. This sharing reduces the risk that any single family will face a sudden shortage while others have enough. Over time, such cooperation increases the stability of survival in environments where resources vary from day to day. Yet even sharing has limits when the environment itself produces less food overall. If multiple hunting or gathering efforts yield smaller returns, the amount available to distribute becomes smaller as well. The group may continue to share what they have, but the portions gradually diminish. Meals may become simpler or less frequent as people adapt to the reduced supply. The structure of the community remains cooperative, yet the landscape is no longer offering the same quantity of nourishment to support it. In this context, the ratio between those who search for food and those who depend on that search becomes increasingly significant. A few successful providers can support many people when resources are abundant, but when opportunities become scarce, the demands placed on those providers increase. They must travel farther, search longer, and attempt new strategies in order to obtain enough food for the entire group. Each unsuccessful attempt carries consequences not only for the individual, but for the wider community waiting for nourishment. Over the course of a season, the accumulation of such moments can gradually reshape the experience of daily life. The effort invested in searching grows heavier, while the results become less certain. The structure of cooperation that once strengthened the group now reveals how closely everyone's well-being is connected to the productivity of the landscape. In this way, the organization of human communities transforms environmental changes into shared experiences. When the land offers fewer resources than before, the effects are not confined to a single person or family. They spread across the entire network of relationships that binds the group together. As the structure of a community becomes more visible through the distribution of food, another quiet reality begins to emerge. The number of mouths that must be fed does not shrink simply because the landscape has become less generous. Children continue to grow and require nourishment each day. Elders still depend on the support of those who can travel and search for food. Even the adults who gather and hunt must maintain their own strength if they are to continue performing the work that sustains everyone else. In this way, the needs of the group remain relatively constant even when the productivity of the environment begins to change. A season that produces less food does not automatically reduce the number of people who rely on that food. Instead, the same group must adapt to a smaller flow of nourishment arriving from the landscape. This situation creates a subtle shift in how each successful search for food is experienced. When a hunting party returns with meat or when gatherers arrive carrying baskets of plants, the food must still be shared across the community as it was before, yet the portions may gradually become smaller as the supply decreases. What once felt like a comfortable distribution may slowly transform into a careful division designed to ensure that everyone receives at least some nourishment. The practice of sharing, which strengthens cooperation during times of abundance, also becomes a way to soften the effects of scarcity. But sharing cannot create food where none exists. It can only distribute what the landscape has provided. Over time, this reality places increasing importance on the productivity of each journey across the territory. A successful hunt or harvest carries weight beyond the immediate moment, because it supports individuals who may not be able to search for food themselves. At the same time, the responsibility placed on those who gather and hunt becomes more visible. Their effort must sustain not only their own bodies but the well-being of the entire community. Anthropological observations suggest that human societies often respond to such pressures through cooperation rather than isolation. Members of a group may continue to share information about where resources might still be found, guiding one another toward areas where plants or animals appear more abundant. People may also adjust their movements, traveling farther or shifting camps to remain closer to potential sources of food. These responses illustrate the flexibility that has helped humans survive in many environments across long periods of history. Yet flexibility has limits when the underlying supply of resources becomes smaller across a region. If fewer plants produce edible harvests and animals appear less frequently along familiar routes, the total amount of nourishment entering the community declines. Even when cooperation remains strong, the group must divide a smaller quantity of food among the same number of people. Gradually, the effects of this imbalance appear in daily life. Meals may feel lighter than before. The time spent searching may grow longer. Individuals who once returned quickly with baskets of plants or signs of animals may now walk greater distances before finding anything useful. None of these changes alone signals the collapse of survival. The community continues to move, to share knowledge, and to search the landscape with persistence. Yet together they reveal a growing tension between the needs of the group and the productivity of the environment. A season that once supported the entire community comfortably may now require greater effort just to maintain balance. The structure of the group, with its children, elders, and providers, remains the same as it was before. What has changed is the flow of nourishment passing through that structure. When this flow becomes thinner across the span of a single season, the challenge is felt not by individuals alone, but by the entire network of relationships that sustains the community. Movement across the landscape was one of the most important ways early human communities responded to changing conditions. When food became scarce in one location, people did not simply remain there waiting for the environment to recover. Instead, many groups followed seasonal paths that connected different parts of their territory. These movements allowed them to reach plants that ripened at different times of the year, or to intercept animals that traveled along migration routes. Over generations, such patterns of travel became deeply familiar. Rivers, valleys, forests, and open plains were not random spaces, but parts of a mental map carried within the memory of the community. People remembered where certain plants tended to grow, where animals had been seen before, and which areas provided shelter or water during particular seasons. This knowledge allowed them to move through the landscape with purpose rather than wandering without direction. Yet even with this accumulated understanding, movement itself carried limits. The distance a community could travel depended on many factors, including the physical strength of its members, the presence of children and elders, and the availability of water along the route. Groups often moved together, carrying tools, gathered plants, and sometimes small fires used for warmth or cooking. Traveling long distances required energy that had to be balanced with the need to conserve strength for gathering or hunting once a new location was reached. If the journey was too long or passed through areas with few resources, the effort required to travel could reduce the energy available for finding food afterward. Because of these constraints, most communities moved within territories that were familiar to them. These territories might cover wide areas, but they still represented a limited portion of the broader environment. Within this range, people learned to recognize the seasonal rhythm of the land. Certain valleys might produce fruit during one part of the year, while nearby wetlands might attract animals during another. By shifting camp locations across the seasons, the group could take advantage of different opportunities as they appeared. This strategy allowed early humans to adapt to the natural variability of the environment. If one location produced less food during a particular time, another area within the territory might still offer useful resources. However, this system depended on the assumption that at least some part of the territory would remain productive during each phase of the year. When environmental conditions affected several areas at once, the effectiveness of seasonal movement could become less certain. A dry period might influence plant growth across many valleys, reducing the availability of edible plants in multiple gathering locations. Animals that normally pass through one region might alter their routes across a wider area, leaving several familiar hunting grounds unusually quiet. In such situations, moving from one location to another might reveal similar conditions rather than improvement. Each new place visited by the group could show signs that the landscape was offering fewer resources than expected. The possibility of traveling beyond the usual territory might still exist, but doing so introduced new uncertainties. Unknown regions might contain unfamiliar plants or animals, and the absence of reliable knowledge about those places could increase the risks of exploration. Water sources might be harder to locate, or the terrain might require longer travel than the group could sustain comfortably. Because survival depended not only on finding food, but also on maintaining the strength of the community, such journeys had to be approached carefully. The landscape that had once supported the group through repeated seasonal movements could therefore become more difficult to navigate when several of its familiar resources declined at the same time. The knowledge carried by elders and experienced adults still guided the group's decisions, yet even that knowledge reflected patterns built from earlier years. When a season unfolded differently from those remembered in the past, the paths that once led toward nourishment might lead instead toward uncertainty. Movement remained a powerful tool for adaptation, but it could not always guarantee that a new location would restore the balance between effort and food. Sometimes, the same season that reduced resources in one valley had quietly influenced the entire region through which the community traveled. As human groups moved through their territories in search of food, the landscape did not appear to them as a uniform space. Instead, it was composed of places that carried different meanings depending on the season. Certain valleys might be associated with fruit-bearing trees, while riverbanks might be remembered as locations where animals came to drink. Open grasslands might offer opportunities to hunt grazing animals during one part of the year, while forested slopes could provide edible roots or nuts during another. Over time, this knowledge formed a seasonal map that guided the movements of the group. Each place was connected to a moment in the cycle of the year when it was most likely to provide nourishment. When the seasons unfolded in ways that resembled previous years, this knowledge allowed communities to move through the landscape with confidence. People could travel to certain areas expecting that food would appear at roughly the same time as before. The journey itself became part of the rhythm of life, linking the group's movement with the natural patterns of plants and animals. Yet the reliability of this system depended on the stability of those patterns. If the environment began to change even slightly, the timing or productivity of familiar locations could shift. A fruiting tree might produce later than expected, or a patch of edible roots might grow smaller after a period of low rainfall. Animals that once passed through a valley during a particular month might arrive earlier, later, or not at all. In such moments, the map carried within memory begins to lose some of its certainty. The group may still travel to the places where food has been found before, yet the outcome of those journeys becomes less predictable. This uncertainty can unfold gradually across the landscape. A group may move to one familiar location and discover that the plants there have produced fewer edible parts than usual. They may then travel to another place that has provided food in previous years, hoping that conditions there will be better. Sometimes this movement reveals a more productive area, restoring the flow of nourishment that supports the community. But at other times, the same pattern appears again. The next valley also offers fewer plants, or the animals that were expected have not arrived. As this pattern repeats across several locations, the difference between the remembered landscape and the present one becomes increasingly clear. The places that once served as reliable points within the seasonal cycle now yield uncertain results. This does not necessarily mean that the environment has failed completely. Plants may still grow and animals may still exist somewhere within the broader region. The challenge lies in the timing and distribution of those resources. The community may be moving through the landscape according to patterns shaped by earlier seasons, while the plants and animals are responding to slightly different conditions in the present. The result is a quiet mismatch between expectation and reality. People continue to travel to places that once provided nourishment, yet the landscape offers less than anticipated when they arrive. When this mismatch occurs across several parts of the territory, the effort required to obtain food begins to increase. The group must spend more time moving between locations, searching for signs that resources remain available somewhere within reach. Each journey carries the hope that the next place will restore the familiar rhythm of abundance. Yet the possibility also grows that the next location will reveal similar conditions to the last. In this way, the seasonal map that once guided movement becomes more difficult to rely upon. Knowledge gathered over generations still shapes the decisions of the group, but the environment itself is responding to conditions that may differ from those remembered in the past. As the season continues, the distance between expectation and experience gradually widens. The landscape remains recognizable, yet its ability to provide food in familiar places begins to feel less certain than before. When the landscape no longer produced food in the familiar places where it had been found before, human communities faced a gradual shift in how they understood their territory. The valleys, forests, and riverbanks that had once served as dependable points within the seasonal rhythm did not disappear, but their relationship to food became less certain. People could still travel along the same routes they had followed in earlier years. They could still recognize the shapes of hills, the bends of rivers, and the stands of trees that marked important gathering areas. Yet when they arrived, the landscape might reveal fewer plants ready to harvest or fewer signs that animals had recently passed through. The knowledge carried by the group remained intact, but the environment was responding to conditions that had changed. In such moments, movement across the territory became more exploratory than routine. Instead of following a sequence of places that were expected to provide food at predictable times, people might begin to search outward from their familiar paths. Hunters could follow faint animal tracks into valleys they had visited less often. Gatherers might examine patches of vegetation that had previously been overlooked when richer areas were available. These explorations did not represent a loss of knowledge, but an attempt to adapt that knowledge to the present conditions of the environment. Over generations, human survival has often depended on this ability to adjust when the landscape behaves differently than expected. Yet exploration also introduces uncertainty. Familiar locations carry the memory of past success, but unfamiliar areas provide no such reassurance. A valley that has not been visited frequently may contain useful plants, or it may hold none that are edible. A distant plain might support animals during certain seasons, but it might also require long travel across terrain where water is scarce. When a community moves into these less familiar spaces, the balance between risk and reward becomes more difficult to judge. The effort required to reach the new area must still be matched by the food that can be obtained there. If the journey produces little nourishment, the energy spent traveling may reduce the group's ability to continue searching elsewhere. This tension between exploration and limitation illustrates an important aspect of life in early human environments. Knowledge of the land could guide movement with remarkable precision when seasonal patterns remained stable. But when those patterns shifted across an entire region, even experienced communities could encounter uncertainty. The landscape still held plants and animals somewhere within it, yet locating them required new decisions about where to travel and how far the group could safely move. Each additional step into unfamiliar terrain represented both possibility and risk. Over the course of a season, repeated journeys into new areas might gradually expand the territory known to the community. If resources were eventually discovered in those places, the group could begin incorporating them into future seasonal movements. In this way, exploration sometimes strengthened long-term adaptation by revealing new sources of nourishment. However, this process required time, energy, and a measure of good fortune. During the season when resources first became scarce, the outcome of such exploration remained uncertain. A community might search across several new locations before finding one that produced sufficient food. Until that discovery occurred, the gap between effort and reward could continue to widen. The land still extended in every direction, filled with hills, rivers, forests, and plains. Yet the distance between the group and the nourishment hidden somewhere within that landscape had become more difficult to bridge than before. The familiar territory had not vanished, but its ability to sustain the rhythm of survival had become less predictable during that particular season. Across long stretches of human history, the difference between a stable season and a difficult one was often connected to patterns that extended far beyond the immediate view of the people living within them. Rainfall might change across distant mountains where clouds first gathered. Temperatures might shift across wide regions where grasses and forests responded slowly to the passing of the year. Rivers might carry less water than usual because snow had melted earlier in lands far away. These larger environmental patterns shape the conditions experienced by plants and animals across entire landscapes. Yet the people living within those landscapes often encountered the results only through small signs appearing in the places they knew best. A valley might seem quieter than before. A fruit tree might carry fewer clusters of ripening fruit. A herd of animals might arrive later than expected, or not at all. These observations did not immediately reveal the broader forces that had influenced them. They appeared instead as local changes that gradually accumulated across the season. Early human communities lived within these vast environmental systems without possessing the tools to measure them directly. They did not track rainfall across distant regions or observe temperature patterns across hundreds of kilometers. Instead, their understanding of the environment emerged through experience and memory. Elders remembered seasons when certain plants had grown abundantly, and others when the harvest had been smaller. Hunters recalled years when animals had appeared in great numbers and years when their tracks had been more difficult to find. These memories helped communities interpret what they were seeing in the present. Yet even the deepest memory could not always predict how the current season would unfold. Environmental conditions can change in ways that extend beyond the scale of human observation. A period of lower rainfall across several regions might influence plant growth over wide areas. When grasses grow less densely, grazing animals may travel farther in search of food. As those animals shift their movements, the hunting opportunities that once appeared reliably in certain valleys may also change. These connections form part of the broader ecological network linking climate, vegetation, animals, and human survival. For the people living within that network, the chain of influence might become visible only through the gradual reduction of familiar resources. One gathering trip might reveal fewer edible plants than usual. A hunting expedition might return with little to show for the effort invested. A second or third journey might produce similar results. None of these experiences alone would necessarily indicate a major change in the environment, but together they begin to suggest that the landscape is responding to conditions that extend beyond the immediate surroundings of the community. The people moving through the territory may not know whether rainfall has changed in distant valleys or whether animal herds have followed new routes across the plains. What they can observe is the outcome of those distant processes appearing in the places they depend on. This difference between cause and experience highlights how environmental systems shape human life in quiet ways. The forces influencing the landscape may operate across distances and timescales that are difficult to perceive directly. Yet, their consequences appear in everyday activities such as gathering plants or searching for animals. When those activities become less productive than before, the change often reflects patterns unfolding across a much larger region. The environment is not failing in a single place but adjusting across many interconnected locations at once. For early human communities, such shifts could transform the meaning of a season. What began as a few quiet signs of reduced abundance might gradually reveal itself as a wider pattern affecting several parts of the territory. The land still holds life, and plants and animals continue their cycles across the landscape. But the relationship between those cycles and the needs of the people moving through them has become less aligned than it once was. The difference may be subtle at first, appearing only through small disappointments in places that once provided nourishment. Yet over time, those small signs accumulate, suggesting that the season itself is unfolding under conditions different from those remembered before. When environmental patterns shift across a wide region, their effects rarely appear all at once. Instead, they move slowly through the landscape, touching different parts of the ecosystem in sequence. Plants may respond first, adjusting their growth to changes in rainfall, soil moisture, or temperature. Grasses that once covered open ground might grow more thinly if water becomes scarce. Fruit-bearing trees may produce smaller harvests if the conditions needed for flowering were interrupted earlier in the season. These changes are not always dramatic. The plants remain present, and the landscape may still appear green, yet the amount of nourishment contained within that greenery can gradually decline. Animals that depend on those plants respond in their own ways. Grazing herds may travel farther in search of better pastures when grasses grow less densely. Some animals may shift the timing of their movements if the growth of vegetation occurs earlier or later than usual. Predators that follow those herds may also adjust their paths, moving into regions where prey remains more abundant. Through these adjustments, the movement of animals across the landscape becomes connected to changes in plant growth that began months earlier. By the time human hunters notice that familiar herds are missing from a valley, the process that influenced those animals may have started far away, in places the hunters have never seen. For people moving through the environment in search of food, these ecological connections often reveal themselves only through experience. A group may travel to a valley that has provided plants or animals in previous seasons and discover that the expected resources are less abundant. They might assume that the change is temporary or that better opportunities exist nearby. After all, landscapes naturally fluctuate, and not every gathering trip or hunt produces the same result. Yet when similar observations occur across several journeys, a pattern begins to emerge. The plants gathered in one area appear smaller or less plentiful. The animals that once passed through familiar routes seem to be traveling elsewhere. Each observation remains local, tied to the particular place where it was made. But taken together, they suggest that the environment across a broader region is behaving differently than it has in the past. This realization does not arrive as a single moment of understanding. Instead, it develops gradually through repeated encounters with the landscape. Elders may recall that certain plants once produced larger harvests during this part of the season. Hunters may remember that animal tracks were more common along certain paths. These memories help the community recognize that the present conditions do not entirely match the patterns known from earlier years. Yet even with this awareness, responding to the change remains difficult. The forces shaping the environment extend beyond the immediate control of the group. Rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, and plant growth across distant valleys all contribute to the situation unfolding in the present. People can adapt by traveling to new areas, adjusting their gathering strategies, or following animals into unfamiliar terrain. These responses demonstrate the resilience that has long characterized human survival. However, adaptation requires time and opportunity. When several parts of the ecosystem shift simultaneously, the process of adjustment may not immediately restore the flow of food to the community. The landscape continues to hold plants and animals somewhere within it, but their distribution and timing no longer align as closely with the movements of the people searching for them. As the season continues, this widening gap between expectation and reality becomes more visible through everyday activities. Each journey across the territory carries the hope that conditions will improve in the next valley or along the next river. Yet the same quiet signs may appear again, suggesting that the change extends farther across the land than anyone first imagined. As these changes move through the ecosystem, their influence gradually reaches the daily routines of the people living within it. What begins as a shift in rainfall or temperature across distant regions eventually appears in the most ordinary moments of life. A gathering trip that once filled baskets quickly may now require hours of searching. Hunters may walk long distances across familiar terrain and return with little sign that animals have recently passed through. The landscape itself has not disappeared, and the paths that cross it remain the same. Yet the results of moving through that landscape begin to feel different. Each journey produces slightly less nourishment than before. Over time, the repetition of these experiences begins to reshape how the season is understood. At first, such moments may be interpreted as ordinary fluctuations. Not every hunt succeeds, and not every patch of plants produces the same harvest each year. People who have lived within a territory for many years understand that nature contains variation. A single unsuccessful journey rarely causes alarm, but when similar outcomes appear again and again, the pattern becomes harder to ignore. A hunter who once followed animal tracks regularly may notice that the ground remains undisturbed for longer periods. Gatherers who once expected to find fruit or seeds at a particular location may discover that those foods are present in smaller quantities. These observations accumulate slowly, forming a quiet recognition that the season is unfolding differently from those remembered in the past. The important point is that this realization does not arrive through a dramatic event. There is no single moment when the environment suddenly announces that it has changed. Instead, the shift reveals itself through a series of small disappointments that appear across many ordinary activities. Each search for food offers another piece of evidence that the balance between people and the land has become more fragile. The community continues to move through its territory with the same determination as before, guided by knowledge gathered over generations. Yet the familiar signs that once confirmed the presence of food begin to appear less frequently. The silence of a valley where animals once travelled may linger longer than expected. A grove of trees that once produced abundant fruit may now offer only scattered harvests among the branches. As these signs accumulate, the experience of the season gradually transforms. The land still contains life, and the group still possesses the knowledge required to move across it, but the connection between effort and nourishment becomes more uncertain. Each journey requires greater persistence, and each success carries greater significance for the people who depend on it. This change does not mean that survival has become impossible. Human communities have adapted to environmental fluctuations for thousands of generations. Yet the difficulty of the season now lies in the growing distance between the productivity of the landscape and the needs of the people who rely on it. When rainfall patterns shift, when plants produce less food, and when animals adjust their movements in response, the entire ecological system continues to function according to its own rhythms. Those rhythms simply no longer align as closely with the expectations formed from earlier seasons. The group still walks the same paths across hills and valleys, guided by memory and cooperation. But the nourishment that once appeared along those paths has become harder to find. What began as a quiet environmental change far beyond human sight has now reached the center of daily life, shaping whether the next search across the landscape will restore the balance that has slowly begun to fade. As a season continues to unfold with fewer resources than expected, the effects of scarcity rarely appear all at once. Instead, they move gradually through the daily rhythm of life. The first signs may be subtle. A gathering trip returns with slightly smaller baskets. Hunters walk across familiar ground without seeing the usual signs of animal movement. These moments might initially be treated as ordinary variation, because nature has never provided exactly the same results each time. Yet, when similar experiences repeat across several days or weeks, the meaning of those small signs begins to change. What once seemed like coincidence begins to form a pattern that the entire group can recognize. The environment still holds plants and animals, but the effort required to find them has increased. As this pattern continues, the daily schedule of the community may begin to shift. People who once spent a certain amount of time gathering plants may now remain away from camp longer in order to collect the same amount of food. Hunters may travel farther across the territory before encountering animals worth pursuing. These longer journeys require greater physical effort, which must eventually be balanced by the nourishment obtained. If the additional effort produces only modest returns, the difference between energy spent and energy gained begins to narrow. This balance is important because human survival depends not only on obtaining food, but also on maintaining the strength required to keep searching for it. When the landscape provides fewer resources, each decision about how to spend time and energy becomes more significant. The community may respond by adjusting its activities in careful ways. Some members may focus more heavily on gathering plants, if hunting becomes less reliable. Others may explore distant areas that have not been visited recently, hoping that conditions there might be different. Knowledge shared within the group becomes especially valuable during such times. Elders may recall locations that produced food during earlier difficult seasons. Experienced hunters may notice small environmental clues that suggest where animals might still be found. These exchanges of memory and observation help guide the group's movements as it adapts to the changing conditions of the landscape. Yet even with careful adjustments, the overall supply of food entering the community may remain smaller than before. When this occurs, the experience of daily meals gradually changes. Portions that once felt generous may become more modest. People may eat more slowly or rely on foods that provide less energy but remain available when others have disappeared. None of these changes necessarily signal immediate danger. Human communities are capable of enduring temporary fluctuations in the availability of food, but the persistence of such conditions can begin to shape the physical and emotional atmosphere of the group. The search for nourishment becomes a more central focus of daily life. Conversations around the fire may turn more frequently toward where food was found or where it might still be discovered. Each successful hunt or gathering trip becomes a moment of relief shared by everyone who depends on it. The landscape remains the same in appearance, yet its relationship to the community has quietly shifted. What once felt like a familiar rhythm of movement and nourishment now requires greater attention and effort to maintain. Over time, the accumulation of these small adjustments reveals how closely human survival is tied to the productivity of the environment. A season that produces fewer resources does not immediately bring collapse. Instead, it slowly changes the balance between the energy people invest in searching for food and the nourishment they receive in return. When this balance grows more fragile across the weeks of a season, the entire community becomes aware that the landscape is asking more from them than it did before. As the season continues under these more difficult conditions, the difference between what the land once provided and what it now offers begins to appear more clearly in the bodies of the people who depend on it. Food is not only a moment of satisfaction during a meal, it is the source of energy that allows people to travel across the landscape, to dig for roots in the soil, to track animals across hills and valleys, and to maintain the strength required for daily survival. When meals become smaller or less frequent, the body gradually begins to adjust to the reduced supply of nourishment. At first, the change may be almost unnoticeable. People may feel slightly more tired at the end of a long journey, or take a little longer to recover their strength after a hunt or gathering trip. Because life in early human environments always required effort, such sensations might not immediately seem unusual, yet as the pattern continues across many days, the cumulative effect becomes more visible. The energy available for long journeys may decline slightly. Individuals may pause more often while traveling, or move more slowly across difficult terrain. These responses are natural adjustments by the body, which attempts to conserve energy when food intake decreases. At the same time, the work required to obtain food often becomes greater during a difficult season. Hunters may need to follow animal tracks across longer distances before finding prey. Gatherers may spend additional time searching through patches of plants that produce fewer edible parts than before. This combination of increased effort and reduced nourishment can gradually reshape the rhythm of daily activity. Tasks that once felt routine may now require more patience and persistence. The distance between camp and the places where food is found may grow longer as people search for resources that remain available. Anthropological observations suggest that human communities often respond to such conditions with cooperation and flexibility. Members of the group may support one another by sharing information about where resources were last seen, or by dividing tasks so that the effort of searching does not fall on a single individual. Some people may focus on gathering foods that are easier to obtain even if they provide less energy, while others continue to search for animals or richer sources of nourishment. Through these adjustments, the community attempts to maintain a balance between the energy spent and the food obtained. Yet this balance becomes increasingly delicate when the landscape continues to produce fewer resources than expected. Even a small reduction in nourishment can influence the body's ability to perform demanding tasks over time. People may still travel across the territory and continue searching with determination, but the effort required to do so becomes more noticeable. A journey that once felt manageable may now feel longer. A hunt that once seemed routine may now require greater concentration and endurance. None of these experiences alone signals immediate failure. Human bodies are capable of adapting to temporary changes in food supply, but when such conditions persist across the span of a season, the physical demands of survival begin to weigh more heavily on the community. The landscape still holds the possibility of nourishment somewhere beyond the horizon of the next hill or forest. Yet reaching that nourishment now requires more energy than before, while the food available to restore that energy has become less certain. In this way, the quiet changes in the environment begin to shape the lived experience of the people moving through it. The connection between the productivity of the land and the strength of the human body becomes visible through each step taken across the territory and each meal shared among the members of the group. As the season moves forward, these conditions, the changes in energy and effort, begin to influence the rhythm of the community in deeper ways. Each journey into the landscape now carries more weight than before, because the outcome of that journey affects not only the present moment, but the strength available for the next search. When a hunting group returns without success, the consequence is not simply the absence of food for that day. It also means that the energy spent traveling, observing, and tracking must be replaced before the same individuals can attempt another search. When nourishment is limited, this recovery becomes slower. The body must work with smaller reserves of energy while still meeting the demands of movement, attention, and cooperation that survival requires. In such a situation, people often begin adjusting their behavior in quiet but meaningful ways. Journeys across the territory may become more carefully planned. Instead of exploring many different directions, the group may focus its efforts on areas where the chance of finding food appears slightly higher based on past experience. Hunters may choose to follow clearer signs of animal presence rather than spending long hours pursuing uncertain tracks. Gatherers may concentrate on plants that remain available even if they provide less nourishment, because the effort required to obtain them is more predictable. These adjustments represent an attempt to conserve energy while still maintaining the search for food. Yet the effectiveness of these strategies depends on the environment continuing to offer at least some resources within reach. If the landscape produces only small returns, the community may find itself investing effort that produces only modest improvement in nourishment. Over time, this pattern gradually reshapes the emotional atmosphere of daily life. The work of finding food becomes more constant in conversation and attention. People may speak more often about where plants were last seen or where animal tracks appeared during a previous journey. The memory of successful hunts or abundant harvests from earlier seasons may return to discussion as individuals attempt to understand why the present season feels different. These reflections do not necessarily indicate despair or fear. Human communities have long been accustomed to living within environments that fluctuate from year to year, but they do reveal a growing awareness that the balance between the land and the people who depend on it has become more delicate. The landscape still offers moments of success. A hunting group may eventually encounter animals after days of searching. Gatherers may discover a patch of plants that has remained productive despite the wider conditions. When such moments occur, they often bring a sense of relief that spreads across the group. Food is shared, strength begins to return, and the rhythm of survival feels briefly restored. Yet the season itself continues to unfold under the same environmental conditions that created the earlier difficulty. The next search may once again require patience and endurance before it produces results. In this way, the community lives within a cycle of effort and recovery that grows more demanding as the season progresses. The human body, the memory of the land, and the cooperation within the group all continue to support the search for nourishment. But each step across the territory now reflects the quiet understanding that the environment is offering less support than it once did. The land has not become empty, and life continues to move through forests, rivers, and plains as it always has. What has changed is the distance between the effort required to reach that life and the nourishment it provides when finally found. As the season approaches its later stages, the accumulated effects of smaller harvests, longer journeys, and uncertain hunts begin to reveal themselves more clearly within the life of the community. None of the earlier changes may have seemed decisive on their own. A gathering trip with fewer plants, a hunt that required more time, or a journey that returned with modest results could each be understood as ordinary variation. Yet when these moments occur repeatedly across the same season, their combined influence becomes harder to overlook. The group gradually recognizes that the landscape is offering less nourishment than it has in the past. The territory remains familiar, but the rhythm that once connected effort with food has become more fragile. During such periods, people often become more attentive to the signs of the environment around them. Small details that might once have passed unnoticed begin to carry greater meaning. The condition of grasses in a valley may suggest whether grazing animals might return soon. The appearance of flowers on certain plants may hint at whether fruit will develop later in the season. The direction of animal tracks, the presence of insects around water sources, and the movement of birds across the sky may all provide subtle clues about where life continues to gather within the landscape. This careful observation reflects a long tradition of ecological awareness that has guided human survival for many generations. Knowledge about plants, animals, and seasonal patterns does not exist as abstract information but as part of everyday attention to the world. When resources become scarce, this attention often deepens as people search for any sign that nourishment might still be found nearby. At the same time, the physical experience of the season continues to shape how the community responds. Meals may remain smaller than in earlier months, and the time spent searching for food may occupy a larger portion of each day. The effort invested in gathering and hunting remains essential, yet it may not always restore the level of nourishment that once felt normal. The body adapts as it can, conserving energy and adjusting to the available supply of food. But these adjustments also remind the group that the balance between people and the environment is still unsettled. Anthropological and ecological studies suggest that human communities often respond to such moments with patience rather than sudden decisions. A difficult season does not necessarily lead to immediate migration or dramatic change. Instead, groups may continue moving through their territory while observing the land carefully, hoping that the next valley or riverbank will reveal signs of recovery. Seasonal conditions can change again, sometimes bringing renewed growth of plants or the return of animal herds that had traveled elsewhere. Because of this possibility, people may remain attentive to the land rather than abandoning familiar places too quickly. Yet the later stages of a difficult season also carry a quiet recognition. The food that will sustain the community through the coming weeks must still be found somewhere within the environment. Each remaining journey across the territory becomes part of the effort to bridge the distance between the present moment and the arrival of more favorable conditions. If plants begin to produce more abundantly or animals return along familiar routes, the balance between effort and nourishment may gradually restore itself. But if the season continues without such changes, the community must continue adapting to the reduced flow of food. In this way, the later weeks of a season reveal the cumulative effects of everything that has occurred before. The landscape has not changed through a single event, but through a series of small shifts that have slowly influenced how plants grow, how animals move, and how people search for nourishment. The community remains guided by memory, cooperation, and careful observation. Yet the season itself now stands as a reminder that the relationship between humans and their environment has always depended on patterns that can quietly change. As the final part of the season continues, the community gradually becomes aware that the present moment is connected to a longer chain of events that began much earlier in the year. The smaller harvests of plants, the quieter valleys where animals once traveled, and the longer journeys required to find nourishment are not isolated experiences. They form part of a pattern shaped by the environmental conditions that unfolded months before. Rainfall that arrived late, temperatures that shifted slightly, or the earlier movement of grazing animals may all have influenced the resources now available. Yet these causes are rarely visible in a single place. Instead, they reveal themselves through the accumulation of many small observations made across the territory. For the people living within this landscape, the meaning of the season becomes clearer through memory and comparison. Elders may recall years when plants grew more abundantly during this same part of the cycle. Hunters may remember when animal tracks were more common along certain paths. These memories do not provide precise explanations for why the present season has changed, but they help the community understand that the difference is real. End quote. The land itself still appears familiar, yet the amount of nourishment it offers has quietly declined. This recognition does not arrive suddenly. It emerges slowly as the weeks pass and the pattern continues. During such moments, communities often rely on the same principles that have guided human survival across thousands of generations. Cooperation remains essential. Food that is found continues to be shared, allowing individuals who have had less success in their searches to still receive nourishment. Knowledge also remains central. People speak with one another about where plants were last seen, which valleys still contain water, or where animals may have moved. These conversations reflect the collective memory of the group, helping guide decisions about where to travel next. Yet even with cooperation and knowledge, the physical limits of the environment remain present. The landscape cannot immediately produce more food simply because people need it. Plants follow their own cycles of growth, responding to rainfall and soil conditions that cannot be changed by human effort alone. Animals move according to the availability of grazing and water across the wider region. The people living within this system can adapt their movements and strategies, but they cannot command the rhythms of the ecosystem itself. Because of this, the final weeks of a difficult season often involve careful patience. The community continues searching for food, while also watching for signs that conditions may soon change. A valley that was quiet earlier may show new animal tracks after rainfall returns to the region. Plants that once appeared small or undeveloped may begin producing edible parts if moisture becomes more available. These possibilities remind people that environmental conditions are rarely permanent. Seasons that bring scarcity are often followed by periods when the land becomes more productive again. Yet during the present moment, the group must still navigate the consequences of what the season has already become. Each meal gathered or hunted carries importance because it helps bridge the time between the present day and the arrival of more favorable conditions. The distance between these two moments can feel long when food is difficult to obtain, but the community continues moving through the landscape with the same persistence that has guided human survival throughout history. The land still holds the resources that life depends upon. The challenge lies in finding them during a season when their appearance has become less predictable than before. By the time the final stretch of the season arrives, the experience of the community has been shaped by weeks of adaptation. What began as a few uncertain gathering trips and quiet hunting grounds has gradually revealed a larger pattern across the territory. The land still contains the same hills, rivers, and forests that people have known for generations. Yet during this particular season, the rhythm that once connected those places to food has become less dependable. People have walked familiar paths many times, adjusting their movements, exploring new valleys, and sharing what nourishment they have been able to find. Through these efforts, the group has continued to survive within the changing conditions of the landscape. But the season itself has shown how delicate the balance between people and their environment can be. One of the most striking aspects of such a season is that no single event marks the beginning of hardship. There is no sudden moment when the environment clearly announces that resources will be scarce. Instead, the shift unfolds through a chain of small changes. Plants produce slightly smaller harvests. Animals move along different routes. The time between successful hunts grows longer. Each change alone may seem minor, yet together they reshape how the entire season feels. By the end of this sequence, the community recognizes that the environment has offered less nourishment than expected. The realization arrives not through a dramatic disaster, but through the accumulation of ordinary experiences repeated across many days. This pattern reveals an important feature of human life in early environments. Survival often depended not on extraordinary events but on the quiet reliability of seasonal cycles. When those cycles aligned with human needs, the land could support communities through a steady rhythm of movement and nourishment. But when even one part of that cycle shifted, rainfall arriving at a different time, plants growing less abundantly, animals changing their routes, the effects could travel through the entire network of relationships connecting humans, plants, animals, and climate. The community might still find food, but the effort required to obtain it could grow steadily greater. Over the course of a single season, this difference could gradually transform daily life. Yet, even in such moments, human survival has rarely depended on a single strategy. The same season that brings difficulty also reveals the resilience that has long characterized human communities. People continue to observe the land carefully, remembering the patterns of earlier years while adjusting to the conditions of the present. They share food when it is found, support those who are less able to search, and move across the territory guided by both memory and cooperation. These responses do not eliminate the challenge created by a difficult season, but they allow the community to endure it. The landscape itself continues to follow its own rhythms. Rain will eventually return to dry valleys. Plants will grow again when conditions allow. Animal herds will follow the shifting patterns of grass and water across the plains. Human communities survive within this broader system not by controlling it but by learning to move with it. A single difficult season, therefore, becomes more than a temporary shortage of food. It becomes a reminder of how closely human life has always been tied to the patterns of the natural world. When those patterns change, even slightly, the experience of survival can shift in ways that are felt across an entire community. And this raises a final reflection about the deeper question that began this story. If so many elements of human survival depend on cycles that can quietly change from one year to the next, how often in the long history of our species might a single difficult season have been enough to push communities toward hunger? When the season finally begins to move toward its closing phase, the landscape slowly reveals whether the difficult period will continue or begin to ease. Small environmental signals may appear that suggest change. Clouds may gather more frequently over distant hills, bringing the possibility of rain to soil that has remained dry for weeks. New green shoots may appear in places where plants had once struggled to grow. Rivers or streams that had run shallow may begin to carry slightly more water. These signs do not immediately restore the abundance that people remember from earlier years, but they hint that the ecological cycle is beginning to shift again. For the community that has spent weeks adjusting to limited resources, Such changes carry quiet significance. The people moving through the territory are often highly attentive to these signals because their survival has always depended on recognizing how the land responds to changing conditions. A hunter walking across open ground may notice fresh tracks where none appeared before. Gatherers moving through a valley may see new flowers forming on plants that had produced little earlier in the season. These observations do not guarantee that food will return quickly, but they suggest that the forces shaping the environment are beginning to move in a different direction. The relationship between people and the land begins to feel slightly less strained. Yet the effects of a difficult season do not disappear immediately when environmental conditions improve. Plants that struggled earlier in the year may require time to grow again before producing edible fruit or seeds. Animals that traveled long distances in search of grazing may not return to familiar valleys until vegetation has recovered. The recovery of the ecosystem unfolds gradually, following its own pace rather than the urgent needs of the people living within it. Because of this, the final weeks of a season often remain a time of careful patience. The community continues searching for food while watching the landscape for signs of renewal. What has changed is the sense that the difficult pattern may not last forever. The land has begun to show the first hints of returning productivity, even if that productivity has not yet reached the levels remembered from earlier seasons. In these moments, memory becomes an important guide once again. Elders who have lived through many years may recall other seasons when the land produced less food before eventually recovering. Their experiences remind the group that environmental fluctuations are part of the broader cycles that shape life across the planet. Periods of scarcity and periods of abundance often follow one another across time. Human survival across thousands of generations has depended on enduring the difficult moments while remaining attentive to the signs that conditions are changing. This understanding does not remove the challenge that the community has already faced. The season has required longer journeys, smaller meals, and constant adaptation to the shifting patterns of the environment. Yet it also reveals something deeper about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Early human communities did not live apart from the ecological systems around them. They lived within those systems, sharing the same climate, vegetation, and animal movements that shaped the entire landscape. When the environment changed, human life changed with it. The difficult season that the community has just experienced becomes part of that long history of adaptation. It reminds the group that survival is rarely the result of complete control over nature. Instead, it grows from the ability to observe, cooperate, and persist through cycles that extend far beyond the experience of a single year. As the season slowly begins to shift once again, the community continues walking across the familiar paths of its territory, guided by the knowledge that the balance between people and the land is always moving, never entirely fixed. As the first signs of renewal begin to appear across the landscape, the meaning of the difficult season becomes clearer in retrospect. What the community has lived through was not simply a period of bad luck or a single failure of one food source. It was a demonstration of how many parts of the natural world must remain aligned for human survival to feel stable. Rain must arrive within a useful range of time. Plants must grow with enough strength to produce edible roots, fruits, or seeds. Animals must move through the land in ways that still intersect with the paths of human hunters. Water must remain available across the routes that connect one resource to another. When these elements work together, a season can appear ordinary and manageable, but when even a few of them shift out of step, the results can travel through the entire ecology of survival. For the people within the community, this truth is rarely learned through abstract thought. It is felt through the body and through memory. It is felt in the longer walks taken to find food, in the smaller meals divided more carefully among children and elders, and in the repeated return to familiar places that no longer yield what they once did. It is also remembered in the contrast between seasons. A valley that now holds fresh shoots after weeks of scarcity may remind the group of how different the same place looked when it failed to nourish them earlier in the year. A riverbank where animals begin to leave new tracks may quietly reveal how much their absence had shaped the season before. In this way, recovery does more than restore food. It also reveals the full contour of what had been missing. This is one of the deeper lessons carried by early human life. Stability was rarely a permanent condition. It was often a temporary alignment between human need and environmental timing. People survived not because the world always provided generously, but because they learned to recognize patterns, remember useful places, and cooperate through periods when those patterns became less reliable. The return of food after a difficult season does not erase the vulnerability that came before it. Instead, it shows that vulnerability more clearly. The land begins giving again, and in that renewed generosity, the community can see how narrowly it had once lived between enough and not enough. Archaeological and anthropological thinking often points toward this broader understanding of prehistory. Human beings were not passive victims of changing landscapes, but neither were they masters of them. They adapted, observed, and responded with remarkable flexibility. Yet their flexibility operated within environmental limits. The body still required steady nourishment. Children still needed to be fed while they grew. Older members still depended on the efforts of others. The territory still had to produce enough food at the right times for the group to endure. When those conditions weakened, even for part of a year, the consequences could move outward through every level of life. And when conditions improved again, the return of abundance could be felt almost as a form of release. The restoration of a more favorable rhythm would not necessarily arrive with celebration in the dramatic sense. More often, it would appear through ordinary moments becoming easier again. A gathering trip might fill baskets more quickly. A hunt might succeed without such long uncertainty. People might return to camp with enough food that the evening meal no longer feels so thinly divided. These small changes would signal that the balance between effort and nourishment had begun to recover. Yet beneath that recovery remains a lasting insight about the long human story. For most of our species past, survival depended on living inside a world where the margin for error could be very small. A season did not need to become catastrophic to become dangerous. It only needed to offer a little less food, a little later, in a landscape where the body could not wait long and where memory could not always force nature to repeat itself. When the difficult season finally passes, life within the community does not suddenly transform into something entirely new. The same paths remain across the hills and valleys. The same rivers continue to mark the routes through the territory. People still rise each day to search for food, guided by the memory of places where nourishment has appeared before. Yet the season that has just ended leaves behind a deeper understanding carried quietly within the experience of the group. It has revealed how closely human survival has always been tied to the subtle rhythms of the natural world. The people who lived through this period did not witness a catastrophic event or a dramatic collapse of the environment. Instead, they experienced a sequence of small changes that slowly altered the balance between effort and nourishment. Plants produced a little less food. Animals passed through familiar places less often. The time required to find each meal grew longer. None of these changes alone would necessarily have seemed decisive, but together they demonstrated how narrow the margin between stability and difficulty could be. For early human communities, this narrow margin was not unusual. It was part of the long relationship between people and the landscapes that sustained them. Human beings did not evolve in environments where food was permanently stored or easily controlled. For most of our history, nourishment appeared through seasonal cycles that depended on rainfall, soil, plant growth, and animal movement. When those cycles aligned well, communities could move through the year with relative stability. When they shifted even slightly, the effort required to survive could increase in ways that were felt across every part of daily life. The season described here, therefore, represents more than a single moment in time. It reflects a pattern that likely occurred many times across the deep history of our species. Archaeological and ecological perspectives suggest that human populations often lived within environments where resources fluctuated from year to year. Some seasons brought abundant harvests of plants and successful hunts. Others offered less, requiring communities to rely more heavily on cooperation, memory, and persistence. These variations formed part of the background against which human culture, knowledge, and social bonds gradually developed. In many ways, the ability to endure such fluctuations helped shape the qualities that still define human societies today. People learned to share food so that temporary success could support the entire group. They learned to remember the landscape across generations, carrying knowledge of plants, animals, and seasonal timing through stories and observation. They also learned to remain attentive to subtle changes in the environment, recognizing that the difference between abundance and scarcity might begin with small signals long before it became obvious. The difficult season now fading into memory therefore becomes part of a larger human story. It reminds us that the stability many people experience in the modern world is relatively recent when viewed across the full span of human history. For most of our species' existence, the relationship between humans and food was shaped by natural cycles that could not be fully predicted or controlled. Communities survived by adapting to those cycles, moving with them rather than attempting to command them. And within that long history lies the quiet answer suggested by the question that began this journey. A single season did not need to bring a great disaster to place early humans in danger. Sometimes it only needed to arrive with slightly less rain, fewer plants and animals that passed somewhere else. In a world where food was rarely stored far beyond the present moment, those small differences could slowly gather into something much larger. And if the balance between people and the land had always rested on such delicate timing, one gentle but difficult question remains at the edge of human history. How many times might our ancestors have stood at the end of a season, looking across the same landscape they knew so well, wondering whether the next one would finally bring enough?